Polar bear attacks. Police cruiser injures 3 officers. December 1st, 2024. The Arctic wind howled across the frozen tundra of Barrow, Alaska, carrying with it the scent of ice, seal blood, and something far more dangerous than the -40-degree temperature that had settled over America's northernmost city like a death shroud. Officer Jessica King pulled her patrol cap down tighter over her short-cropped auburn hair, her breath forming crystalline clouds that immediately froze and shattered against the reinforced windshield of Police Unit 7. She had been patrolling these desolate streets for 8 years, ever since she'd graduated from the Alaska State Trooper Academy in Sitka, but she had never grown accustomed to the bone-deep cold that seemed to seep through even the heaviest winter gear and settle permanently in her bones. Jesus Christ, Jess, my coffee froze solid before I could finish half the cup, complained Officer Robert Lopez from the passenger seat, holding up a ceramic mug that contained what looked like brown ice with a small wooden stirrer protruding from the center. Roberto, as everyone called him, was a transplant from Phoenix who had moved to Alaska 15 years earlier following a messy divorce and a desire to start fresh somewhere nobody knew his name or his failures. He was 43 years old, had graying temples that made him look distinguished despite his perpetually worried expression, and possessed an unfortunate tendency to complain about the weather, as if he hadn't voluntarily signed up to police one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth. "That's what you get for bringing that weak Arizona Constitution up to God's country," laughed Officer Aaron Fields from the back seat, though his laughter was somewhat muffled by the thick wool scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face. Aaron was the youngest of the 3, just 26 years old, and had been born and raised in Barrow. His Inupiat grandmother, Elena Kunguk, had taught him to read the signs of polar bear movement in the ice formations and cloud patterns, knowledge that had probably saved his life more than once during his 4 years on the force. He was tall and lanky, with jet-black hair and dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and he possessed an easy smile that had charmed half the single women in their small community of fewer than 5,000 residents. The 3 officers were conducting their regular evening patrol through the residential areas of Barrow, driving slowly along Stevenson Street in their modified Ford Police Interceptor that had been specially equipped with heated seats, an auxiliary heating system, studded winter tires rated for extreme Arctic conditions, and reinforced windows designed to withstand both the brutal cold and the occasional thrown beer bottle from unhappy locals. The vehicle's radio crackled with sporadic communications from dispatcher Margaret Toulouse, a 60-year-old Inupiat woman who had been coordinating emergency services in Barrow for over 3 decades and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every family, feud, and secret in the community. "Unit 7, this is dispatch." Margaret's voice came through the radio with the characteristic static that plagued all electronic communications in the extreme cold. "We've got reports of some unusual polar bear activity near the school. Fish and Wildlife says there's been a young male spotted near the playground equipment earlier today. Keep your eyes open out there." Jessica picked up the radio microphone, pressing the talk button with a gloved finger. "Copy that, dispatch. We'll swing by the school on our next pass. Any word on whether they've got trank equipment ready if we need backup?" Fish and Wildlife Officer Sarah Tikovic is on standby with the darting equipment, but she's responding to another call near Point Barrow. Estimated response time, if you need her, would be approximately 30 minutes, depending on weather and visibility. Aaron leaned forward from the back seat, his breath fogging the air between the 3 officers. "My grandmother always said December 1st was bad medicine for bears. Something about the way the ice forms this time of year drives them inland looking for food. The seal hunting's been poor this season." Roberto adjusted the heater vents to blow directly on his hands, which he held cupped in front of the warm air. Your grandmother says a lot of things, Aaron. Last week, she told you that ravens landing on the power lines meant somebody was going to die, and the only thing that happened was old Mrs. Peterson's cat got stuck in her chimney. Yeah, well, Mrs. Peterson's cat did almost die, Aaron replied with a grin. Maybe Grandma Elena's just working with a broader definition of somebody than the rest of us. Jessica smiled, despite the tension that had been building in her shoulders since they'd received the dispatch call. She genuinely enjoyed working with these two men, despite their tendency toward gallows humor and Roberto's constant complaints about the climate. In a community as small and isolated as Barrow, the police force functioned more like an extended family than a traditional law enforcement agency. They responded to everything from domestic disputes to medical emergencies to wildlife encounters, and they depended on each other not just professionally but personally in ways that officers in larger cities could never truly understand. The residential streets of Barrow stretched out before them in a grid pattern of modest homes, most of them raised on stilts to prevent the permafrost from melting and destabilizing the foundations. Warm yellow light glowed from most windows, creating small beacons of human comfort against the vast darkness that surrounded their community. Street lamps provided pools of illumination every 100 yards, but between these circles of light lay stretches of absolute blackness where anything could be hiding. The few residents who were out at this hour moved quickly between buildings, bundled in so many layers of clothing that they resembled walking sleeping bags more than human beings. Jessica turned the cruiser left onto Agvik Street, driving slowly to avoid the patches of ice that formed regularly, despite the city's best efforts to keep the roads clear. The vehicle's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling snow that seemed to dance in the light like supernatural entities celebrating some macabre winter festival. She had always found something both beautiful and terrifying about Arctic winter nights, when the combination of extreme cold, isolation, and perpetual darkness created an environment that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance and sanity. "So what's the protocol if we do encounter this bear?" Roberto asked, unconsciously checking that his service weapon was secure in its holster. I know we're supposed to call Fish and Wildlife, but what if we don't have time to wait 30 minutes for backup? Aaron shifted in the back seat, the leather of his gear creaking with the movement. "First thing is, we don't get out of the vehicle unless we absolutely have to. Polar bears can run 35 miles per hour, and they can maintain that speed for longer than you might think. A full-grown male can weigh anywhere from 800 to 1,500 pounds, and their claws are longer than your fingers. Getting out of the car to confront one would be essentially committing suicide." "What about our weapons?" Jessica asked, though she hoped they wouldn't have to find out the answer through practical experience. "A 9mm service pistol might eventually stop a polar bear, but you'd better be a hell of a shot, and you'd better have perfect placement," Aaron explained. "These animals have thick skulls, dense muscle, and a fat layer that can absorb a lot of damage before it reaches anything vital. Fish and Wildlife carries 12-gauge shotguns loaded with slugs specifically for bear encounters, and even then they prefer to use tranquilizers when possible." Roberto shook his head, making a sound that was half laugh and half groan. "I knew I should have stayed in Phoenix. The worst thing I had to worry about there was drug dealers and drunk drivers. Nobody ever mentioned that police work in Alaska might involve fighting prehistoric monsters." "Polar bears aren't prehistoric," Aaron corrected with the patient tone of someone who had explained this many times before. "But they are perfectly adapted killing machines that have been hunting in this environment for thousands of years. They're incredibly intelligent, they have excellent hearing and smell, and they're opportunistic predators. A polar bear won't necessarily hunt humans, but if it's hungry enough, or if it feels threatened, it won't hesitate to defend itself." Jessica slowed the cruiser as they approached the intersection with Browerville Road, the main thoroughfare that connected the residential areas with the commercial district and the school complex. The Samuel Simmons Memorial Hospital came into view on their left, its windows glowing with the harsh fluorescent lighting that seemed to be standard in all medical facilities. Dr. Maria Santos, the head of emergency medicine, was probably inside right now dealing with the usual collection of winter-related injuries, frostbite, slip and fall accidents, and the occasional alcohol poisoning that seemed to spike during the darkest months of the year. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7, Jessica spoke into the radio. "We're approaching the school complex now. Visual inspection of the perimeter. No signs of wildlife activity at this time. Copy, Unit 7. Please maintain radio contact and report any unusual observations." The Ipaluk Elementary School loomed ahead of them, a low-slung modern building surrounded by playground equipment that looked eerily skeletal against the snow-covered landscape. The swing sets and jungle gyms cast strange shadows in the patrol car's headlights, creating the illusion of movement where there should be none. Jessica drove slowly around the perimeter of the school property, her trained eyes scanning for any signs of disturbance in the snow, unusual tracks, or the telltale signs of a large animal's presence. "There," Aaron said suddenly, pointing toward a section of snow near the school's main entrance. "Do you see those marks in the snow?" About 20 feet to the right of the front doors. Jessica stopped the cruiser and activated the vehicle's spotlight, a powerful halogen beam that could illuminate objects up to 200 yards away. The light revealed a series of large, distinctive tracks in the snow, each print approximately 12 inches long with 5 clearly defined toe marks and claw impressions extending several inches beyond the pads. "Those are definitely polar bear tracks," Aaron confirmed, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "And they're fresh. See how the edges are still sharp? In this wind, tracks start to blur and fill in within an hour or two. I'd say this animal was here within the last hour, maybe less." Roberto leaned forward to get a better look through the windshield. "How big would you estimate this bear to be, based on the tracks?" Aaron studied the prints carefully, drawing on years of traditional knowledge passed down from his grandmother and other elders in the community. "Based on the size and depth of these tracks, I'd say we're looking at a young adult male, probably in the 600 to 800-pound range. Not a giant, but definitely big enough to be extremely dangerous." Jessica picked up the radio microphone again. "Dispatch, Unit 7. We've confirmed fresh polar bear tracks at the elementary school. Tracks appear to be from a young adult male. Estimated time frame within the past hour. Please advise if there have been any additional sightings or reports." Margaret's voice crackled back through the radio with increased urgency. "Unit 7, I've got Sarah Tikovic on the line from Fish and Wildlife. She's asking if you can determine the direction of travel from the tracks." Aaron opened his door slightly, letting in a blast of frigid air that immediately filled the car's interior with the sharp scent of ice and snow. He studied the tracks more carefully, following their progression across the schoolyard with his flashlight. After a few minutes, he closed the door and turned back to his colleagues. "The tracks come from the northeast, from the direction of the lagoon, and they head southwest toward the residential area. The animal definitely spent some time here, probably investigating the playground equipment. There are some disturbance marks near the swings that suggest it might have been testing different objects, maybe looking for food or just curious about human-made structures." Jessica felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. "Southwest toward the residential area. That means it's heading toward the populated part of town." Roberto checked his watch, noting that it was now 8:47 p.m. "What's the normal pattern for bears in this situation? Do they usually continue moving through town, or do they tend to circle back toward their original territory?" That's the problem, Aaron replied, his expression growing more concerned. Young male bears are unpredictable. An older, more experienced bear would probably avoid human areas and stick to the ice where the hunting is better. But a young male might be curious about human activity or desperate enough for food to take risks that an older bear wouldn't take. The radio crackled again with Margaret's voice. Unit 7. Fish and Wildlife Officer Tikivik is requesting that you follow the tracks if possible, maintaining a safe distance and report on the animal's direction of travel. She's en route with tranquilizer equipment and should be able to join you within 20 minutes. Jessica put the cruiser in gear and began following the tracks across the school property, using the spotlight to maintain visual contact with the trail while staying far enough away to avoid surprising the bear if it was still in the immediate area. The tracks led them across the school parking lot, around the side of the building, and then continued southwest toward the intersection of Akovak and Tikigak streets, one of the more densely populated residential areas in Barrow. As they followed the trail, Roberto shared some background about his experiences with dangerous wildlife encounters during his years on the force. I've responded to bear calls before, but always black bears or brown bears down in the Anchorage area when I was working with the state troopers. Never anything like this. Polar bears are supposed to be the most dangerous bears in North America, right? Without question, Aaron confirmed. Black bears and brown bears are omnivores. They eat fish, berries, vegetation, whatever they can find. Polar bears are pure carnivores. They're designed specifically to hunt and kill other animals, primarily seals, but they're opportunistic enough to take whatever prey is available. An adult male polar bear is basically a 1,000-pound predator with no natural enemies and no fear of humans. Jessica guided the cruiser carefully along the tracks, which remained clearly visible in the fresh snow. The trail led them through a section of empty lot between two houses, then across someone's backyard, where the bear had apparently investigated a garbage can, leaving it overturned and scattered across the snow. The contents of the garbage bag were spread in a rough circle, and the bear's tracks indicated it had spent several minutes examining the debris, probably looking for anything edible. Looks like he's definitely hungry, Jessica observed. Going through garbage isn't typical polar bear behavior unless they're desperate. The radio interrupted their conversation. All units, this is dispatch. We've received reports of a large animal near the community center on Kinnick Street. Multiple witnesses report seeing what they describe as a polar bear moving through the area within the past 10 minutes. Unit 7, please respond. Jessica felt her heart rate increase as she realized they were less than half a mile from Kinnick Street. Copy, dispatch. Unit 7 responding. ETA approximately 5 minutes. She accelerated the cruiser as much as she dared on the icy roads, following the most direct route toward the community center while maintaining radio contact with dispatch. Aaron continued to provide information about polar bear behavior and safety protocols, drawing on both his formal training and the traditional knowledge he had learned from his grandmother and other elders in the community. The thing about polar bears that makes them so dangerous, Aaron explained as they drove, is that they don't have the same fear response to humans that other bears have developed. Most bears will try to avoid human contact whenever possible. Polar bears haven't had enough historical interaction with humans to develop that avoidance behavior. To a polar bear, humans are just another potential food source. Roberto checked his service weapon again, though he knew it would be of limited effectiveness against a polar bear. What about making noise? I've heard that works with other types of bears. Not reliable with polar bears, Aaron replied. Brown bears and black bears might be scared off by noise, bright lights, or aggressive behavior. Polar bears are more likely to interpret those behaviors as a challenge or as signs that you might have something worth investigating. The best strategy is to avoid contact entirely, and if contact is unavoidable, to make yourself appear as non-threatening as possible while slowly backing away. As they approached Kinnick Street, Jessica could see a small group of people standing outside the community centre, pointing and talking animatedly. She parked the cruiser about 50 yards away from the group and activated the vehicle's emergency lights to alert other drivers and pedestrians to the potential danger in the area. Dispatch, Unit 7, on scene at the community centre. We have visual contact with approximately 6 civilians who appear to have witnessed the polar bear, requesting backup units and EMS to be on standby. Margaret's voice came back immediately. Unit 7, backup units are en route. Unit 3, with officers Tom Brower and Jennifer Amaugak, estimated arrival in 8 minutes. EMS is standing by at the hospital. Fish and Wildlife Officer Tikivik is approximately 15 minutes out. Jessica turned to her colleagues with a serious expression. We need to interview these witnesses and try to determine the bear's current location and direction of travel. But we also need to maintain situational awareness. If this animal is still in the immediate area, we could have a dangerous situation developing very quickly. The 3 officers exited their patrol vehicle, immediately feeling the brutal cold of the Arctic air against their exposed skin. Even with their heavy winter gear, the temperature was cold enough to cause frostbite on exposed flesh within minutes. They approached the group of witnesses, who appeared to be a mix of adults and teenagers, who had been leaving the community centre after some kind of evening activity. "Good evening, folks," Jessica called out as they approached. "I'm Officer King with the Barrow Police Department. We understand you may have seen a polar bear in this area. Can anyone tell us what you observed?" A middle-aged Inupiat man named David Panigeo stepped forward from the group. David worked as a maintenance supervisor for the North Slope Borough and had lived in Barrow his entire 48 years. He was known in the community as a reliable witness who didn't exaggerate or embellish his stories. "Officer King, we were just leaving the community centre after the school board meeting when we heard this noise from over by the parking area," David explained, pointing toward a section of the parking lot that was partially obscured by snow berms left by the plows. It sounded like metal clanging, like someone was banging on a car, or maybe going through the dumpster. A teenager named Marcus Kanguk, who was Aaron's 17-year-old nephew, added his observations. "When we looked over there, we saw this huge white shape moving around near the cars. At first we thought it might be someone in a white parka, but then we realized it was way too big and moving in a weird way." "How big would you estimate the animal was?" Roberto asked, taking notes in a small pad that he kept in his jacket pocket. An elderly woman named Ruth Amaugak, who was Jennifer Amaugak's grandmother and one of the most respected elders in the community, spoke up in her soft but authoritative voice. "That bear was bigger than any polar bear I've seen around here in recent years. I'd guess maybe 700-800 pounds. Young male, probably 2 or 3 years old, based on the way it moved and held its head." Aaron nodded respectfully to Ruth, knowing that her knowledge of local wildlife was based on over 7 decades of living in the Arctic. "Did you see which direction the bear went when it left the area?" David pointed toward the residential streets that stretched away from the community centre toward the south. "It wandered around the parking lot for maybe 5 minutes, checking out different cars, and then it headed off that way, toward the houses on Ockpick Street. That was maybe 10-15 minutes ago." Jessica felt a growing sense of urgency as she realized the bear was moving deeper into the residential area, potentially putting more civilians at risk. "Did anyone see the animal interact with any vehicles? Any damage to cars or property?" Marcus stepped forward again, clearly excited to be part of an official police investigation. "Yeah, the bear went up to Mr. Tutu's pickup truck and started sniffing around it. It put its paws up on the hood and looked through the windshield. Then it went over to the dumpster behind the community center and knocked the lid off. There was garbage scattered all over the place. Ruth added, "That bear looked hungry to me. The way it was investigating everything, looking for food. Usually polar bears don't spend this much time in town unless they're having trouble finding seals out on the ice." Roberto looked up from his notes with concern. "So we have a hungry polar bear moving through a residential area. How many houses are we talking about in the direction it was heading?" David considered the question, mentally mapping out the neighborhood layout. Oak Pick Street has maybe 15 houses on each side, and then it connects to several other streets. Could be 50 or 60 houses within a few blocks of where the bear was last seen. Jessica picked up her radio to update dispatch on their findings. "Dispatch, Unit 7. We've interviewed witnesses at the community center. Polar bear last seen approximately 15 minutes ago, heading south toward Oak Street residential area. Animal appears to be actively foraging and may be food stressed. Recommend immediate notification to residents in the affected area." Margaret's response came back with increased urgency. "Copy, Unit 7. Initiating reverse 911 calls to all residents in the Oak Street area. Message will advise residents to remain indoors, secure all doors and windows, and report any sightings immediately to 911. As the officers continued their interview with the witnesses, backup arrived in the form of Unit 3 with officers Tom Brower and Jennifer Amayo-Gak. Tom was a veteran officer with 12 years of experience in Arctic law enforcement, while Jennifer was Ruth's granddaughter and had been on the force for about 2 years. Both officers were well respected in the community and had extensive experience with wildlife encounters. "What's the situation?" Tom asked as he and Jennifer joined the group. Aaron provided a quick briefing on the bear's movements and current estimated location. "We've been tracking it from the school through several residential properties, and now witnesses last saw it heading toward Oak Street about 15 minutes ago. Fish and Wildlife is en route, but still about 10 minutes out." Jennifer, who had grown up listening to her grandmother's stories about polar bear behavior, added her perspective. "This time of year, young males are often struggling to establish territory and find adequate food sources. The sea ice formation has been later than usual this season, which means the seals aren't in their normal hunting areas." Tom nodded, understanding the implications. "So we potentially have a desperate, hungry predator moving through a populated area. What's our containment strategy?" Jessica outlined the plan she had been formulating. "I think we need to split up to cover more ground. Unit 7 will continue following the tracks and try to maintain visual contact with the animal. Unit 3 can set up a perimeter on the far side of the residential area to prevent the bear from moving deeper into town. When Fish and Wildlife arrives, they can coordinate the tranquilization attempt." As the officers were discussing their strategy, the radio crackled with an emergency transmission from dispatch. All units, emergency traffic. We have reports of a polar bear in direct contact with a residence on Oak Street. Multiple 911 calls reporting an animal attempting to gain entry to a home. Address is 412 Oak Street. Residents are trapped inside." The calm professionalism that had characterized the evening suddenly exploded into controlled chaos as both police units activated their emergency lights and sirens and began racing toward the reported address. Jessica felt her adrenaline surge as she realized they were about to transition from tracking and observation to active emergency response. "Dispatch, Units 3 and 7 responding to 412 Oak Street," Jessica reported over the radio. "ETA approximately 3 minutes. Please advise Fish and Wildlife of our location and request immediate response." As they drove toward the emergency, Aaron provided additional information about polar bear behavior when they encounter human habitation. If the bear is trying to get into a house, it means it can probably smell food inside, or it's attracted to other odors like cooking meat or garbage. Polar bears are incredibly strong and persistent. If it really wants to get inside, standard residential doors and windows might not stop it. Roberto felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. What exactly are we going to do when we get there? We can't shoot it if there are people nearby, and we can't physically confront it. Our primary objective is to distract the animal and draw it away from the residence, Jessica explained, though she was making up the strategy as she went along, drawing on her training and instincts. We'll use the vehicles, lights, and sirens to get its attention, then try to lead it away from populated areas until fish and wildlife can tranquilize it. Tom's voice came over the radio from Unit 3. Unit 7, we're approaching from the north end of Oakpick Street. Do you have visual contact with the residents? Negative on visual contact, but we should have it within 30 seconds, Jessica replied as she turned onto Oakpick Street and began scanning house numbers. The street was typical of Barrow residential areas, with modest single-story homes raised on stilts and connected by a network of wooden walkways designed to navigate the challenging terrain and weather conditions. Most of the houses had small yards enclosed by simple fences, and several had dog houses or storage sheds scattered around the properties. There, Aaron pointed toward a house about halfway down the block. I can see emergency lights reflecting off the snow, and there's definitely some kind of commotion going on. As Unit 7 approached 412 Oakpick Street, the scene that unfolded in their headlights was like something from a nightmare. A massive polar bear, larger than any of the officers had expected, was standing on its hind legs against the front door of a small blue house, using its powerful claws to tear at the wooden frame around the door. The animal was enormous, easily 8 feet tall when standing upright, and its cream-colored fur was stained with what appeared to be blood around its mouth and paws. Jesus Christ, Roberto breathed, staring at the scene through the windshield. That thing is huge. The bear's behavior was frenzied and desperate. It would scratch at the door for several seconds, then drop down to all fours and pace in a circle before returning to attack the entrance. The wooden doorframe was already showing significant damage, and it was clear that the animal would eventually succeed in gaining entry if something wasn't done immediately. Jessica parked the cruiser about 30 yards from the house, close enough to effectively intervene, but far enough away to maintain a safe distance. She activated the vehicle's spotlight and directed it at the bear, which immediately stopped its attack on the door and turned toward the bright light. "Dispatch, Unit 7 on scene at 412 Oakpick Street," Jessica reported over the radio. "We have visual contact with a large male polar bear actively attempting to gain entry to the residence. Animal appears agitated and possibly injured. We are attempting to draw it away from the building." The polar bear stood motionless for several seconds, its black eyes reflecting the spotlight's beam like dark mirrors. It was clearly evaluating this new development, trying to determine whether the police vehicle represented a threat, an opportunity, or simply an irrelevant distraction from its primary goal of reaching whatever had attracted it to the house. Aaron studied the animal's behavior with the experienced eye of someone who had grown up in polar bear country. "Look at the way it's holding its head and the blood around its mouth. I think it might be injured. Maybe got into a fight with another bear or hurt itself trying to hunt on unstable ice. That would explain why it's so desperate to get into human areas." Tom's voice came over the radio from Unit 3, which had taken position at the opposite end of the block. "Injured animals often become more aggressive and take greater risks to find food." The bear suddenly dropped to all fours and began moving toward Unit 7. Its massive head lowered and its small ears flattened against its skull in a posture that Aaron immediately recognized as aggressive. The animal moved with surprising speed and grace, despite its enormous size, covering the distance between the house and the patrol car in just a few seconds. "It's coming toward us," Roberto said, his voice tight with fear. "What do we do now?" Jessica's training kicked in as she put the vehicle in reverse and began backing away from the approaching bear, maintaining the spotlight on the animal while trying to lead it away from the residential area. "We stick to the plan. Keep it focused on us and draw it away from the house and toward an area where fish and wildlife can safely tranquilize it." The polar bear followed the retreating police car for about 50 yards before stopping and turning back toward the house, apparently deciding that whatever was inside was more important than investigating the vehicle. This behavior confirmed Aaron's suspicion that the animal was specifically attracted to something in the residence, probably food odors that had triggered its hunting instincts. "It's going back to the house," Aaron observed. "We need a different approach." Jennifer's voice came over the radio. "Unit 7, we can see the bear from our position. It's back at the front door and appears to be making progress breaking through the frame. We need to take more aggressive action to distract it." Jessica made a decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. She drove the patrol car closer to the house, activated the vehicle's siren, and began honking the horn in short, sharp blasts designed to startle the bear and draw its attention. The noise was incredibly loud in the quiet Arctic night, and the polar bear immediately responded by abandoning its attack on the door and turning toward the source of the disturbance. This time, the bear's response was more aggressive. Instead of simply approaching the patrol car, it charged directly toward Unit 7 with the unmistakable intent of eliminating what it perceived as a threat to its food source. The animal moved with terrifying speed, its powerful legs propelling its massive body forward with the force of an avalanche. "It's charging!" Roberto shouted, though his warning was unnecessary since all 3 officers could see the 800-pound predator racing toward them with murderous intent. Jessica threw the patrol car into reverse and pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the icy road conditions prevented the vehicle from gaining traction quickly enough to outrun the charging bear. The animal closed the distance in seconds, and Jessica realized with horrible clarity that they were not going to escape before the bear reached them. The impact, when it came, was unlike anything any of the 3 officers had ever experienced. The polar bear launched itself at the front of the patrol car with the full force of its body weight, landing on the hood with a metallic crash that seemed to shake the entire vehicle. The bear's massive claws screeched across the metal as it struggled to maintain its grip, and its enormous head was suddenly visible through the windshield, separated from the officers by only a thin layer of supposedly unbreakable glass. The bear's face was a vision of primal fury. Its black lips were pulled back to reveal yellowish teeth that were longer and sharper than anything the officers had imagined. Its small, dark eyes seemed to burn with intelligence and rage, and its breathing created clouds of vapor that immediately froze against the windshield. The animal was so close that the officers could see individual hairs in its fur and smell its distinctive odor of fish, seal oil, and wild animal musk. "Nobody move," Aaron whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of the bear's claws scraping against the vehicle's metal surface. "Sudden movements might trigger an attack response." The polar bear seemed to be evaluating the situation, trying to determine how to reach the potential prey that was tantalizingly close but protected by the vehicle's shell. It pressed its massive paws against the windshield, testing the glass's strength, and the officers could hear the material beginning to creak under the enormous pressure. Roberto had drawn his service weapon, but held it pointed toward the floor of the vehicle, understanding that firing inside the confined space of the patrol car would be catastrophically dangerous to his colleagues. How long can that windshield hold up against something like this? Police vehicle windshields are designed to withstand significant impact, Jessica replied, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. "But they're not necessarily designed to handle the claws and teeth of an 800-pound predator." The bear shifted its weight on the hood, causing the entire front end of the vehicle to compress under its mass. The officers could hear metal creaking and plastic cracking as various components of the patrol car were damaged by the enormous weight. More alarmingly, they could see spider web patterns beginning to form in the windshield where the bear's claws had scratched against the glass. Aaron continued to provide information about polar bear behavior, partly to help his colleagues understand what they were dealing with, and partly to manage his own fear through the familiar routine of sharing knowledge. "The bear is trying to figure out how to get to us. It knows we're food, but it hasn't encountered this situation before. If we're lucky, its curiosity will eventually overcome its aggression and it will lose interest." "And if we're unlucky?" Roberto asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "If we're unlucky, it will find a way through the glass, or it will find a weaker part of the vehicle's structure." The radio crackled with Tom's voice from Unit 3. "Unit 7, what's your status? We can see the bear on your vehicle from our position, but we don't have a clear shot for our firearms, and we're concerned about hitting you if we try to intervene." Jessica picked up the radio microphone with hands that were trembling slightly from adrenaline. "Unit 3, we're secure inside the vehicle for now, but the windshield is showing stress fractures. The bear is actively trying to gain access. What's the ETA on Fish and Wildlife backup?" Margaret's voice came through dispatch. "Unit 7, Fish and Wildlife Officer Tikivic is approximately 5 minutes out. EMS is staged and ready. Please maintain your position and avoid any actions that might escalate the situation." The polar bear suddenly shifted its attention from the windshield to the driver's side window, apparently deciding that the side glass might offer easier access to its prey. It slid off the hood and moved around to Jessica's side of the vehicle, rising up on its hind legs to bring its massive head level with the window. The bear pressed its nose against the glass, leaving fog marks from its breath, and began testing the window's strength with its claws. "It's trying to find a weak point," Aaron observed. "This is actually intelligent problem-solving behavior. The bear is systematically testing different parts of our defenses." The scratching sound of claws against glass was nerve-wracking, but more concerning was the way the window began to show stress marks, where the bear's claws were concentrating pressure on small areas. Police vehicle windows were designed to be difficult to break from the outside, but they had their limits, and none of the officers knew exactly what those limits were when faced with a determined polar bear. Roberto watched the bear's methodical assault on their vehicle with growing anxiety. "How long do you think we can hold out in here?" "As long as we need to," Jessica replied with more confidence than she felt. "This vehicle is our lifeline. As long as we stay inside and don't do anything to provoke the bear further, we should be safe until Fish and Wildlife arrives with the tranquilizer equipment." The bear suddenly dropped back to all fours and moved to the rear of the vehicle, disappearing from the officer's view. For several seconds, they could only hear the sound of claws scratching against metal and the occasional thump as the animal tested different parts of the patrol car's structure. "Where is it now?" Roberto asked, trying to turn in his seat to see out the back window. Aaron had a better view from the back seat. "It's at the rear of the car, investigating the spare tire and the equipment compartment. It seems particularly interested in the area where we keep the emergency medical kit and the road flares." Jessica realized that the emergency medical kit probably contained food items like energy bars and electrolyte packets, which might be attracting the bear's attention. "Aaron, can you see what it's doing back there?" "It's standing on its hind legs again, pressing against the rear window. I can see its claws, and they're leaving scratches in the glass just like they did on the windshield." The rear window of the patrol car was smaller and potentially less robust than the windshield, and the officers could hear an ominous creaking sound as the bear's weight pressed against the glass. More alarming still, they could see the window beginning to bow inward under the pressure. "That window's not going to hold," Roberto said, stating what all three officers were thinking. Jessica made another radio call to update their increasingly desperate situation. "Dispatch, Unit 7. The polar bear is systematically testing our vehicle's structural integrity. Multiple windows are showing stress damage. We need immediate backup from Fish and Wildlife." Margaret's response was immediate. "Unit 7, Officer Tikovic is 2 minutes out. Unit 5 with Sergeant Williams is also responding. Maintain your position." The polar bear had moved around to Roberto's side of the vehicle and was now pressing its massive paws against the passenger window, apparently having identified this as another potential weak point. The animal's behavior was becoming more frenzied, possibly because it could smell the officers inside the vehicle and was frustrated by its inability to reach them. "Look at its eyes," Aaron said quietly. "That bear is completely focused on us. It's not going to give up easily." The passenger window suddenly made a sharp, cracking sound, and a spiderweb pattern of fractures spread across the entire surface. The glass held for the moment, but it was clear that one more concentrated application of pressure would cause it to fail completely. "The window's compromised," Roberto reported, unconsciously leaning away from his side of the vehicle. "If that glass goes, we're in serious trouble." Jessica was frantically trying to think of options that might save their lives if the bear succeeded in breaching the vehicle. Their firearms would be difficult to use effectively in the confined space, and even if they managed to shoot the animal, there was no guarantee that they could stop it before it inflicted serious injuries on all three officers. The sound of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance, growing louder as the backup units raced toward their location. The polar bear also heard the approaching sounds and raised its head to look in the direction of the noise, momentarily distracted from its assault on the patrol car. "That might be Fish and Wildlife," Jessica said hopefully, "or one of our backup units." The bear dropped back to all fours and moved away from the patrol car, apparently deciding to investigate these new arrivals. The officers could see the animal's massive form moving through the snow toward the sound of approaching vehicles. And for the first time since the attack began, they felt like they might survive the encounter. "It's moving away from us," Aaron reported, "heading toward whatever's coming down the street." A new voice came over the radio. "This is Fish and Wildlife Officer Sarah Tikovic. I'm approaching the scene with tranquilizer equipment. Can someone give me a visual on the bear's location?" Jessica grabbed the radio microphone. "Officer Tikovic, the bear just moved away from our vehicle and is heading in your direction. It's a large male, probably 800 pounds, and it's been acting aggressively. Be extremely careful." Sarah's response was calm and professional. "Copy that. I have the animal in sight, preparing to deploy tranquilizer dart. All units maintain distance and avoid sudden movements or loud noises." The officers in Unit 7 watched through their damaged windows as Sarah Tikovic's Fish and Wildlife vehicle came to a stop about 100 yards away. They could see her emerging from the driver's side with what appeared to be a large rifle, probably the tranquilizer gun loaded with the sedatives needed to safely neutralize the polar bear. The bear had noticed the new arrival and was moving toward Sarah's vehicle with the same determined aggression it had shown toward the police cruiser. However, Sarah was prepared for this encounter and had the proper equipment to deal with a dangerous polar bear. "She's taking aim," Aaron observed. "This needs to be a perfect shot. If she misses, or if the tranquilizer doesn't take effect quickly enough, that bear could be on her before she has time to reload." The tranquilizer rifle made a distinctive popping sound as Sarah fired the dart, followed immediately by a roar of pain and anger from the polar bear. The dart had found its mark, penetrating the animal's thick fur and injecting the sedative chemicals into its bloodstream. However, the bear's response was not what the officers had expected. Instead of slowing down or showing signs of sedation, the animal became even more aggressive, apparently interpreting the pain from the dart as an attack that needed to be answered with violence. "The dart hit, but it's not slowing down," Roberto observed with growing alarm. "How long does it usually take for those tranquilizers to work?" Aaron had witnessed several polar bear tranquilizations during his years on the force. It depends on the size of the animal and where the dart hits. For a bear this size, it could take anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes for the drugs to take full effect. In the meantime, the bear is going to be extremely dangerous. The polar bear charged towards Sarah's vehicle with the same terrifying speed and determination it had shown earlier. Sarah managed to get back inside her vehicle and close the door, but the bear was already climbing onto the hood of her truck, repeating the same behavior it had displayed with Unit 7. "Officer Tikivic, are you secure in your vehicle?" Jessica called over the radio. "Affirmative, but this animal is not responding normally to the tranquilizer. It should be showing some signs of sedation by now, but if anything, it seems more aggressive than before." Tom's voice joined the radio conversation. Could the bear have some kind of resistance to the tranquilizer? Or maybe the dart didn't deliver the full dose. Sarah's response was troubling. It's possible the dart didn't penetrate deeply enough through the bear's fat layer to deliver the full dose of sedative. "I'm going to need to attempt a second shot, but I'll need the animal to move away from my vehicle first." Didi. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous as the polar bear continued its assault on Sarah's truck. The animal seemed to understand that these vehicles contained humans, and its determination to reach them was unwavering despite the tranquilizer dart that should have been taking effect. Sergeant Mike Williams arrived on scene in Unit 5, bringing additional backup and more options for dealing with the crisis. Mike was a 20-year veteran of Arctic law enforcement and had dealt with more polar bear encounters than any other officer in the department. "This is Sergeant Williams." His voice came over the radio with the calm authority of experience. "I'm on scene and assessing the situation. Officer Tikivic, what's the status on that tranquilizer dart?" "The dart hit the animal approximately 5 minutes ago, but we're not seeing the expected sedation response. I need to attempt a second shot, but I need the bear distracted and away from my vehicle." Mike quickly developed a plan to coordinate the multiple units on scene. "Unit 3, I need you to use your siren and lights to draw the bear's attention away from Officer Tikivic's vehicle. Once the animal moves away, she'll have an opportunity for a second tranquilizer shot. All other units maintain position and be ready to provide support." Tom and Jennifer in Unit 3 immediately activated their emergency lights and siren, creating a cacophony of noise designed to attract the polar bear's attention. The strategy worked, and the animal abandoned its attack on Sarah's truck to investigate this new disturbance. "The bear's moving toward Unit 3, Aaron reported from his position in the damaged Unit 7. "Officer Tikivic should have a clear shot now." Sarah emerged from her vehicle once again, this time moving quickly to get into position for a second tranquilizer shot. The polar bear was about 50 yards away, distracted by the lights and sirens from Unit 3, presenting what appeared to be an ideal opportunity for another dart. The second tranquilizer shot was fired with the same distinctive popping sound, and once again the bear roared in pain and anger as the dart found its target. This time, however, the officers could see that the dart had struck the animal in a more vulnerable area, probably delivering a more effective dose of sedative. "Good hit," Sarah called over the radio. "Second dart deployed. We should start seeing effects within the next few minutes." The polar bear's behavior began to change noticeably after the second tranquilizer shot. Its movements became less coordinated, and its aggressive posture started to relax as the sedatives took effect. The animal seemed confused, shaking its massive head and stumbling slightly as it tried to continue its pursuit of the police vehicles. "It's working," Roberto observed with relief. "The bear is definitely slowing down." Aaron watched the animal's behavior with the trained eye of someone who understood polar bear physiology. "The sedatives are taking effect, but it's going to take a few more minutes before the bear is completely neutralized. These are incredibly strong animals with remarkable resistance to drugs." The polar bear made one more half-hearted attempt to approach Unit 3, but its movements were now clearly impaired by the tranquilizers. The animal swayed on its feet, took a few unsteady steps, and then sat down heavily in the snow, apparently no longer able to maintain its aggressive pursuit of the humans. "The bear is down," Sarah reported over the radio. "Tranquilizers are taking full effect. The animal is conscious, but heavily sedated. We need to move quickly to get it relocated before the drugs wear off." Sergeant Williams coordinated the next phase of the operation. "All units, the immediate danger has passed. Unit 7, what's the status of your vehicle and crew?" Jessica conducted a quick assessment of her situation. "Unit 7 is secure. Vehicle has significant damage to multiple windows and body panels, but all 3 officers are uninjured. We're going to need a replacement vehicle to continue patrol duties." The adrenaline that had sustained the officers throughout the encounter was beginning to fade, replaced by a combination of relief, exhaustion, and the delayed shock that often follows life-threatening situations. Roberto was shaking slightly, whether from cold or stress, and even Aaron's usual calm demeanor showed signs of strain. Sarah Tikovic approached the sedated polar bear with the caution of someone who understood that even tranquilized animals could be dangerous. She carried additional sedative darts as a precaution, along with the specialized equipment needed to safely handle and transport a large polar bear. "The bear appears to be a young adult male, probably about 3 years old," Sarah reported as she examined the animal from a safe distance. "It's underweight for its size, which explains why it was so desperate for food that it was willing to attack human habitation. The bear was indeed massive, even while lying sedated in the snow. Its cream-colored fur was thick and luxurious, perfectly adapted for Arctic survival, but the officers could see that the animal was thinner than it should be for the approaching winter season. The blood around its mouth and paws appeared to be from minor injuries, probably sustained while breaking into garbage containers or attempting to hunt on unstable ice." "What's the procedure now?" Jessica asked, as she, Roberto, and Aaron finally exited their damaged patrol vehicle. Sarah explained the process while keeping a careful eye on the sedated bear. "We'll load the animal onto a specialized transport vehicle and relocate it to a remote area where it's less likely to encounter humans. The tranquilizers will keep it unconscious for several hours, giving us plenty of time to get it far away from populated areas." Dr. Maria Santos arrived on scene in an ambulance with EMT Greg Amaogak, ready to provide medical attention to anyone who might have been injured during the encounter. Although none of the officers had been physically harmed, Maria insisted on conducting brief medical examinations to check for signs of shock, hypothermia, or other stress-related conditions. "You gentlemen have been through a significant trauma," Dr. Santos explained as she checked Roberto's blood pressure and heart rate. "It's important that we make sure you're not experiencing any delayed physical reactions to the stress." The examination revealed that all 3 officers were in good physical condition, though their heart rates and blood pressure were elevated, consistent with the adrenaline response to extreme danger. Dr. Santos recommended that they take the rest of the night off duty to allow their systems to return to normal. As the immediate crisis wound down, the officers had time to fully assess the damage to their patrol vehicle. The hood was deeply scratched and dented from the bear's claws. The windshield had multiple stress fractures, and both side windows were cracked but still intact. The rear window had been completely destroyed, leaving glass fragments scattered throughout the back seat where Aaron had been sitting. "This vehicle is definitely out of service," Sergeant Williams observed as he surveyed the damage. "It's going to need extensive bodywork and complete window replacement before it's safe to drive again." The cost of repairing Unit 7 would eventually total more than $15,000, making this one of the most expensive wildlife encounters in the department's history. However, all three officers understood that they had been extraordinarily fortunate to escape without serious injury or death. Word of the polar bear attack spread quickly through the small community of Barrow, as news always did in a town where everyone knew everyone else. Within an hour of the incident, curious residents began driving past the scene to see the damaged police vehicle and get first-hand accounts of what had happened. David Panigeo, who had been one of the original witnesses at the community center, stopped by to check on the officers and offer his perspective on the incident. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen a polar bear act that aggressively toward vehicles. Usually they're curious about cars and might investigate, but they don't typically attack like that." Ruth Amaugak, the elderly elder who had provided such accurate information about the bear's size and condition, offered her own analysis. That bear was desperate. "The sea ice has been forming later each year, and the seals aren't where they used to be. Young bears like that one are having trouble learning to hunt in the changing conditions." Aaron found his grandmother Eleanor Kanguk among the crowd of onlookers who had gathered to view the aftermath of the attack. Elena examined the claw marks on the patrol car with the eye of someone who had spent decades studying polar bear behavior and traditional hunting methods. "Your ancestors would be proud that you survived an encounter like this," Elena told her grandson, "but they would also be concerned about what it means that the bears are becoming so desperate that they're willing to attack metal vehicles to reach humans." The broader implications of the incident were not lost on the community leaders and wildlife management officials who arrived on scene. Climate change was affecting Arctic ecosystems in ways that were driving polar bears into increasingly dangerous conflicts with human populations. Sarah Tikovic spent considerable time documenting the incident for her reports to state and federal wildlife agencies. The aggressive behavior displayed by the bear, combined with its obvious malnutrition, represented a troubling trend that wildlife managers across the Arctic were struggling to address. "This won't be the last incident like this," Sarah warned as she completed her documentation. "As the traditional hunting grounds become less reliable, we're going to see more bears taking greater risks to find food. That means more potential conflicts with human populations." The sedated polar bear was successfully loaded onto a specialized transport vehicle using a hydraulic lift system designed specifically for moving large, dangerous animals. The entire process took nearly 2 hours and required the assistance of several additional wildlife officers who were called in from other areas. "Where will you relocate the bear?" Roberto asked, still fascinated by the logistics of dealing with such a massive and dangerous animal. Sarah explained the relocation process. "We'll transport it to a remote area about 50 miles north of here, near some reliable seal hunting grounds. The hope is that it will be able to find adequate food sources and won't return to human areas. However, young bears like this one sometimes have trouble adapting to new territory." The transport vehicle departed just before midnight, carrying the unconscious polar bear toward what everyone hoped would be a more suitable habitat. However, experienced wildlife officers knew that relocation was not always a permanent solution, especially for bears that had already learned to associate human areas with potential food sources. As the scene was finally cleared and the various emergency vehicles departed, Jessica, Roberto, and Aaron found themselves riding back to the police station in Unit 3 with Tom and Jennifer. The contrast between the cramped quarters of their damaged patrol car during the attack and the relative spaciousness of the backup vehicle was not lost on any of them. "I keep thinking about how close we came," Roberto said as they drove through the quiet streets of Barrow. "If that windshield had failed, or if the bear had managed to get through one of the side windows." Aaron nodded soberly. "Polar bears are incredibly powerful animals. If it had managed to get into the vehicle with us, none of us would have survived." Jessica was quiet for most of the ride back to the station, processing the events of the evening and trying to understand how a routine patrol had evolved into a life-threatening encounter with one of the Arctic's most dangerous predators. She had always known that police work in Barrow carried unique risks, but the reality of facing an 800-pound carnivore had been more terrifying than she had ever imagined. Back at the police station, the three officers were required to complete detailed incident reports documenting every aspect of the bear encounter. The paperwork would eventually total more than 30 pages and would be reviewed by multiple agencies, including the Alaska State Troopers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the North Slope Borough Administration. Sergeant Williams debriefed the officers, focusing on what had worked well during the incident and what lessons could be learned for future wildlife encounters. "Your decision to stay in the vehicle probably saved your lives. A lot of officers might have been tempted to get out and try to use their firearms, which would have been essentially suicide against a polar bear." The debriefing also revealed some concerning gaps in the department's preparation for polar bear encounters. While all officers received basic wildlife training, none of them had been specifically prepared for the possibility that a polar bear might attack their vehicle with such determination and intelligence. "We need to update our protocols," Williams concluded. "This incident shows that polar bears are capable of more sophisticated problem-solving than we previously understood. They can systematically test a vehicle's weak points and potentially find ways to breach our defenses." The three officers were finally released from duty at approximately 2:30 a.m., more than 6 hours after their shift was supposed to have ended. All of them were physically and emotionally exhausted, but they also felt a strong sense of camaraderie that comes from surviving a dangerous situation together. "I don't think I'm going to be able to sleep tonight," Roberto admitted as they prepared to leave the station. "Every time I close my eyes, I can see that bear's face pressed against the windshield." Aaron offered some perspective based on his cultural background and experience with Arctic wildlife. "My grandmother always taught me that encounters with polar bears are meant to teach us something about our relationship with the natural world. Maybe this experience is supposed to help us understand something we didn't know before." Jessica appreciated Aaron's philosophical approach, but she was more focused on the practical implications of the incident. "What I learned tonight is that we need better equipment and training for dealing with polar bears. If we're going to continue patrolling in an environment where these encounters are possible, we need to be better prepared." The damage to Unit 7 meant that the police department would be short one patrol vehicle for several weeks while repairs were completed. In a community with limited resources and only 4 patrol cars, this represented a significant operational challenge that would require adjustments to duty schedules and patrol coverage. Over the following days, news of the polar bear attack spread beyond Barrow to regional and eventually national media outlets. The story of 3 police officers trapped in their patrol car while an 800-pound predator tried to break in captured the imagination of people who had never experienced the realities of Arctic life. A reporter from the Anchorage Daily News drove up to Barrow to interview the officers and write a feature story about the incident. Jessica, Roberto, and Aaron found themselves reluctant celebrities, fielding questions from journalists who seemed more interested in sensational details than in the broader implications of climate change on polar bear behavior. "People want to hear about the scary parts," Jessica complained after a particularly frustrating interview session. "They want to know about the claws and teeth and how frightened we were. But they don't seem interested in understanding why the bear was so desperate that it was willing to attack a police car." The incident also attracted attention from wildlife biologists and polar bear researchers who were studying the effects of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. Dr. Stephen Amstrup, an internationally renowned polar bear expert, contacted Sarah Tikovic to request copies of her incident reports and video footage from the patrol car's dashboard camera. "This type of aggressive behavior toward vehicles is becoming more common across polar bear habitat," Dr. Amstrup explained during a phone interview with local officials. "As sea ice becomes less predictable and seal hunting becomes more difficult, bears are being forced to take greater risks and explore new food sources." The dashboard camera footage from Unit 7 provided unprecedented documentation of polar bear behavior during an aggressive encounter with humans. The video clearly showed the animal's systematic approach to testing the vehicle's defenses, its problem-solving abilities, and its determination to reach what it perceived as a food source. This footage is scientifically valuable because it shows how intelligent these animals are, Dr. Amstrup noted. The bear didn't just randomly attack the vehicle. It methodically tested different weak points, adapted its strategy when the initial approach didn't work, and showed persistence that suggests a high level of cognitive function. The residents of 412 Ockpick Street, whose home had been the bear's original target, were interviewed by investigators trying to understand what had attracted the animal to their residence. The family, consisting of Robert and Mary Tutu and their 3 children, had been cooking caribou stew earlier in the evening, and the smell of cooking meat had apparently drawn the bear's attention. "We heard this scratching at the door, and we thought it might be a neighbor's dog, or maybe somebody playing a prank," Mary Tutu explained. "Then we looked out the window and saw this enormous white shape trying to break down our front door. We've lived here for 15 years, and we've never had a polar bear come right up to the house like that." The Tutu family had followed proper safety protocols by remaining inside their home, securing all doors and windows, and calling 911 for assistance. Their quick thinking had prevented what could have been a tragic encounter between the hungry bear and a family with young children. Investigation of the bear's trail revealed that the animal had spent considerable time in residential areas before the final confrontation with the police. Garbage cans had been overturned and investigated at multiple houses, and the bear had left tracks and claw marks on several vehicles and outbuildings. This bear had been exploring human areas for probably several hours before we encountered it, Aaron realized as he studied the evidence. It was systematically searching for food sources and becoming increasingly bold about approaching human habitation. The incident raised questions about early warning systems and community preparedness for polar bear encounters. While Barrow had established protocols for dealing with wildlife in residential areas, the speed and unpredictability of the December 1st incident had revealed gaps in the community's ability to respond quickly enough to prevent dangerous situations. Margaret Toulouse, the veteran dispatcher who had coordinated communications during the incident, proposed improvements to the emergency response system. "We need better coordination between police, fish and wildlife, and community members who might spot bears in residential areas. A few minutes of earlier warning could make the difference between a successful intervention and a tragic outcome." The psychological impact of the incident on the three officers became apparent in the days and weeks following the attack. Roberto experienced recurring nightmares about being trapped in the patrol car while the bear clawed at the windows, and he found himself constantly checking locks and security systems at his home. "I know it sounds irrational, but I keep imagining that bear coming back, looking for us specifically," Roberto admitted during a counseling session with Dr. Santos. "I understand intellectually that the animal was relocated and that it doesn't have any personal vendetta against us, but the fear response is still there." Aaron dealt with his stress by spending time with his grandmother Elena, discussing the incident from both modern law enforcement and traditional Inupiat perspectives. Elena's generation had lived through times when polar bear encounters were more common and when traditional knowledge about animal behavior was essential for survival. "Your grandfather once told me about being stalked by a polar bear for 3 days while he was hunting seal near Point Barrow," Elena shared. "He said the most important thing was to never show fear, but also to never underestimate the intelligence and persistence of these animals." Jessica found herself becoming almost obsessed with learning everything she could about polar bear behavior, ecology, and conservation. She read scientific papers, attended webinars, and corresponded with researchers who were studying the effects of climate change on Arctic predators. "I need to understand what happened that night," Jessica explained to her colleagues. "Not just the immediate facts of the encounter, but the bigger picture of why that bear was so desperate and what it means for our community going forward." The repair of Unit 7 took longer than expected due to the specialized nature of the damage and the difficulty of obtaining replacement parts in remote Arctic locations. The patrol car had to be shipped to Anchorage for bodywork, window replacement, and mechanical repairs that couldn't be performed locally. When Unit 7 was finally returned to service 3 weeks later, all three officers noticed psychological challenges with returning to patrol duties in the repaired vehicle. Roberto was particularly affected, experiencing anxiety attacks when they drove past locations associated with the bear encounter. "It's not just about the specific vehicle," Dr. Santos explained during a follow-up counseling session. "Trauma can become associated with places, objects, and situations that remind us of the original incident. The important thing is to work through these feelings rather than avoiding them." The incident had lasting effects on police procedures throughout northern Alaska. The Alaska State Troopers revised their training protocols to include more comprehensive information about polar bear behavior and safety procedures, and several departments invested in upgraded communications equipment and emergency response tools. Sarah Tikivic worked with state wildlife agencies to develop improved rapid response procedures for polar bear encounters in residential areas. The December 1st incident had demonstrated the need for faster deployment of tranquilizer equipment and better coordination between law enforcement and wildlife management agencies. "Every minute counts in a situation like this," Sarah emphasized during training sessions with police departments across the North Slope. "The difference between a successful intervention and a tragedy can literally be measured in seconds." The story of the polar bear attack became part of local folklore in Barrow, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. Children who had grown up hearing abstract warnings about polar bear safety now had a concrete example of why those precautions were necessary. Marcus Kanguk, Aaron's nephew, who had been one of the original witnesses at the community center, used the incident as the basis for a school project about Arctic wildlife and climate change. His presentation included interviews with the officers, wildlife experts, and community elders who placed the incident in the broader context of environmental changes affecting polar bear populations. "What happened to my uncle and the other officers is part of a bigger story about how the Arctic is changing," Marcus explained during his presentation. The bears aren't becoming more aggressive because they want to hurt people. They're becoming more desperate because their traditional food sources are becoming less reliable. The cost of responding to the incident extended far beyond the repair bills for Unit 7. Fish and wildlife agencies spent thousands of dollars on tranquilizer equipment, transportation, and personnel costs related to capturing and relocating the bear. Emergency medical services had been mobilized, backup officers had worked overtime, and administrative costs associated with investigating and documenting the incident were substantial. Sergeant Williams calculated that the total cost of the December 1st polar bear incident exceeded $50,000 when all direct and indirect expenses were included. For a small community with limited resources, this represented a significant financial burden that highlighted the economic impact of human-wildlife conflicts in the Arctic. These incidents are expensive in terms of both money and human resources, Williams noted in his report to the North Slope Borough Administration. As climate change continues to affect polar bear behavior, we need to budget for more frequent and more costly wildlife encounters. The relocated polar bear was tracked for several weeks using a GPS collar that had been attached during the tranquilization process. The tracking data revealed that the animal had initially moved further north as intended, but had then begun a gradual migration back toward human areas. This is unfortunately typical behavior for relocated polar bears, Dr. Amstrup explained when reviewing the tracking data. Once a bear has learned that human areas can provide food sources, it often returns to those areas even after being moved hundreds of miles away. The tracking collar eventually indicated that the bear had died approximately 6 weeks after the relocation, probably from starvation or injuries sustained while attempting to hunt in unfamiliar territory. While this outcome eliminated the immediate threat of the animal returning to Barrow, it also represented the failure of relocation as a long-term solution to human polar bear conflicts. We saved human lives by relocating that bear, but we weren't able to save the bear itself, Sarah Tikovic reflected. That's the tragic reality of these situations. Often, the choice comes down to human safety versus animal welfare, and human safety has to take priority. The death of the relocated bear added another layer of complexity to the psychological impact experienced by the 3 officers. While they understood that they had acted appropriately to protect themselves and their community, they also felt a sense of responsibility for the ultimate fate of the animal that had attacked them. I know that bear was just trying to survive in a world that's becoming harder for its species, Jessica said during a group counseling session 6 months after the incident. That doesn't change the fact that it nearly killed us, but it makes the whole situation feel more tragic than heroic. 1 year after the polar bear attack, the 3 officers participated in a commemoration ceremony organized by the Barrow Police Department to recognize their survival of the incident and to raise awareness about the ongoing challenges posed by climate change and human-wildlife conflicts in the Arctic. The ceremony included presentations by wildlife experts, community elders, and government officials who placed the December 1st incident in the broader context of environmental and social changes affecting Alaska's North Slope. The damaged windshield from Unit 7 was displayed as a reminder of both the immediate danger the officers had faced and the larger challenges facing Arctic communities. What happened to Officers King, Lopez, and Fields represents a new reality that we're going to have to learn to live with, explained Dr. Amstrup during his presentation at the ceremony. Climate change is creating conditions that force polar bears and humans into conflict situations that previous generations never had to deal with. The ceremony also honored the memory of the polar bear that had been killed during the incident, acknowledging that the animal had been a victim of environmental changes beyond its control. A traditional Inupiat blessing was performed by Elena Kanguk Aaron's grandmother, to recognize the connection between human and animal communities in the Arctic ecosystem. "All life is sacred," Elena said during the blessing ceremony. "When humans and animals come into conflict, it is usually because the balance of the natural world has been disturbed. We must work to restore that balance while protecting both our communities and the animals that share our homeland." The anniversary ceremony attracted media attention from across Alaska and served as a platform for discussing broader issues related to climate change, Arctic wildlife conservation, and the challenges facing indigenous communities in the far north. Environmental organizations used the opportunity to highlight the connection between global carbon emissions and the specific incident that had nearly cost 3 people their lives. "The polar bear that attacked these officers didn't make a choice to become dangerous," explained Dr. Rebecca McDonald, a climate scientist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. "That bear was responding to environmental pressures created by human activities thousands of miles away from Barrow. Climate change is not an abstract future threat, it's a present reality that's creating life and death situations for people and animals in the Arctic right now." The 3 officers used their experience as a platform for advocating for improved polar bear safety measures in Arctic communities. They testified before the Alaska State Legislature about the need for better funding for wildlife management programs, improved emergency response equipment, and enhanced training for law enforcement officers who work in polar bear habitat. "We were lucky," Roberto told the Legislative Committee. "Our vehicle held up just long enough for help to arrive, and the tranquilizer equipment was available when we needed it. But luck isn't a sustainable strategy for dealing with a problem that's only going to get worse as climate change continues to affect polar bear populations." Their advocacy efforts resulted in increased state funding for polar bear research and management programs, including the purchase of additional tranquilizer equipment for fish and wildlife officers and enhanced training programs for law enforcement personnel throughout northern Alaska. The incident also contributed to the development of new technologies designed to prevent human polar bear conflicts. Motion-activated warning systems were installed in several high-risk areas around Barrow, and researchers began developing non-lethal deterrent devices specifically designed to discourage polar bears from approaching human habitation. The December 1st incident taught us that we need to be more proactive about preventing these encounters, rather than just responding to them after they occur, Sarah Tikovic explained. Early warning systems and effective deterrents could prevent bears and humans from getting into life-threatening situations in the first place. 5 years after the polar bear attack, Jessica King had been promoted to sergeant and was leading the Barrow Police Department's Wildlife Encounter Training Program. She used her experience from December 1st to help other officers understand the realities of confronting large Arctic predators and the importance of following safety protocols even in extreme situations. "The most important lesson from our encounter is that these animals are incredibly intelligent and persistent," Jessica would tell new officers during training sessions. "You can't outrun a polar bear, you can't overpower a polar bear, and you can't intimidate a polar bear. Your only chance of surviving an encounter is to use your brain, follow your training, and rely on your equipment and backup." Roberto Lopez had transferred to a position with the Alaska State Troopers in Anchorage, seeking a law enforcement environment with fewer wildlife-related risks. However, he continued to speak at training sessions about the psychological impact of traumatic incidents and the importance of mental health support for officers who work in high-stress environments. "The physical danger from that bear attack lasted maybe 30 minutes, Roberto would explain during his presentations, but the psychological effects lasted for years. Departments need to be prepared to provide long-term support for officers who experience traumatic incidents. whether they involve human criminals or wild animals. Aaron Fields remained with the Barrow Police Department and eventually became the department's liaison with fish and wildlife agencies and community organizations focused on polar bear safety. He worked closely with his grandmother Elena and other elders to document traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior and to integrate that knowledge with modern wildlife management techniques. My ancestors lived with polar bears for thousands of years without the kind of conflicts we're seeing today, Aaron would explain during community education sessions. The difference is that the environment has changed in ways that create new pressures on both human and animal populations. We need to combine traditional wisdom with modern science to find solutions that work for everyone. The polar bear that attacked Unit 7 was never forgotten by the three officers or by the community of Barrow. The incident became a symbol of the broader challenges facing Arctic communities as they adapt to the realities of climate change and environmental disruption. A small memorial plaque was installed at the Barrow Police Department headquarters, commemorating both the survival of the three officers and the death of the polar bear. The inscription read, "In memory of all those affected by the changing Arctic, human and animal alike, may we find wisdom in our conflicts and healing in our shared struggles." The story of December 1st, 2024, continued to be told throughout Alaska and beyond, as an example of how climate change was creating immediate, life-threatening challenges for communities in the Arctic. It served as a reminder that environmental issues were not abstract policy debates, but urgent human safety concerns with real consequences for real people. The damaged windshield from Unit 7 was eventually donated to the University of Alaska Museum of the North, where it became part of an exhibit about climate change and its effects on Arctic wildlife and human communities. Visitors from around the world would examine the claw marks in the safety glass and try to imagine what it must have been like to be trapped inside a vehicle while an 800-pound predator tried to break in. This windshield represents a moment when the abstract concept of climate change became a very concrete and personal reality for three police officers, the museum's curator would explain to visitors. It's a reminder that environmental changes happening in the Arctic affect real people's lives in immediate and dramatic ways. 10 years after the incident, polar bear encounters in Barrow and other Arctic communities had become significantly more common, just as wildlife experts had predicted. The protocols developed in response to the December 1st attack had been refined and expanded, but the fundamental challenge remained: how to protect human communities while preserving polar bear populations in an environment that was changing faster than either species could adapt. Jessica King, now Chief of Police in Barrow, would often reflect on how that single night had shaped not only her career, but her understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. The terror of being trapped in a vehicle while a massive predator tried to reach her had evolved into a deeper appreciation for the complexity of Arctic ecosystems and the urgent need for solutions to human-wildlife conflicts. That polar bear didn't attack us because it was evil or aggressive by nature, Chief King would explain to visiting researchers and journalists. It attacked us because it was hungry and desperate, trying to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to its species. In a way, we were all victims of the same larger forces that are reshaping the Arctic. The story of the polar bear attack on December 1st, 2024, became part of the historical record of climate change impacts in the Arctic, documented in scientific papers, government reports, and academic studies. But for the three officers who lived through it, the incident remained intensely personal. A night when they came face to face with one of the planet's most powerful predators and survived to tell about it. As the Arctic continued to warm and change, new generations of police officers, wildlife managers, and community leaders would study the lessons learned from that December night in Barrow. The courage, professionalism, and quick thinking displayed by officers King, Lopez, and Fields under extreme pressure became a model for how to respond to human-wildlife conflicts in an era of environmental uncertainty. The polar bear that died 6 weeks after its relocation became a symbol of the larger tragedy unfolding across the Arctic as climate change disrupted ecosystems that had remained stable for thousands of years. Its desperate attempt to find food by attacking a police vehicle represented the broader struggle of Arctic wildlife to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions. In the end, the story of December 1st, 2024 was about more than just a dangerous encounter between humans and a wild animal. It was about courage under pressure, the bonds formed between people who face danger together, and the complex relationship between human communities and the natural world they inhabit. It was about adaptation, survival, and the ongoing challenge of coexisting with powerful forces, both natural and human-made, that shape life in the Arctic. The 3 officers who survived that night carried its lessons with them for the rest of their careers and their lives. They had looked into the eyes of a desperate predator and seen not just danger, but a reflection of the broader environmental challenges that would define the future of the Arctic and all who called it home. Blood on the hardwood. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above the polished maple floor of the Glacier Valley Community Recreation Center as Marcus Chen adjusted his knee brace for the 3rd time that evening. At 34, the former college basketball player still moved with the fluid grace that had once earned him a scholarship to Montana State, though his body reminded him daily of the years and accumulated injuries. The Tuesday Night Pickup League had become his sanctuary, a place where software engineers, mechanics, teachers, and retirees could forget their daily troubles and lose themselves in the rhythmic bounce of leather on wood. "You ready to get schooled again, old man?" called out Devin Rodriguez, a 26-year-old paramedic whose infectious grin and boundless energy made him both beloved and insufferable on the court. Devin had moved to Glacier Valley 6 months ago from Phoenix, drawn by Montana's promise of outdoor adventure and a slower pace of life. What he hadn't expected was to find a second family among the aging athletes who gathered twice weekly in the gym that smelled perpetually of sweat, floor wax, and dreams deferred. Marcus chuckled, bouncing the ball between his legs in a practiced rhythm. "Keep talking, rookie. My knees might creak, but my shot's still pure." The familiar weight of the basketball felt reassuring in his hands, a constant in a world that seemed to shift beneath his feet with increasing frequency. His divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. His teenage daughter Emma now lived with her mother in Billings, and the empty house on Cedar Street echoed with memories he wasn't ready to confront. The Glacier Valley Community Recreation Center sat on the eastern edge of town, a sprawling complex built in 1987, with federal funding and community pride. The main gymnasium could accommodate 2 full basketball courts, though tonight they were using only one, the other half dark and draped in shadows that seemed to press against the boundaries of the harsh overhead lighting. Beyond the gym's walls, the building housed a smaller exercise room, administrative offices, and a kitchen used for community events. But it was the gym's location that made it unique, backed directly against the Glacier National Forest, with only a narrow strip of parking lot and a chain-link fence separating the building from wilderness that stretched unbroken for millions of acres. Sarah Mitchell had been warning people about that proximity for months. The 38-year-old wildlife biologist worked for the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department and had been tracking increased bear activity throughout the Flathead Valley all summer. The drought had been particularly severe, pushing wildlife down from higher elevations in search of water and food. Garbage cans had been raided, campsites disturbed, and there had been 3 confirmed sightings of a large grizzly within the town limits over the past 2 weeks. "They're getting more aggressive," she had told the town council just last Tuesday, her presentation filled with charts showing increased human-bear encounters across northwestern Montana. Food sources in the backcountry are scarce. They're adapting, learning that human areas mean easy calories. The rec center, especially with its location right against the forest boundary, is particularly vulnerable. But Tuesday night basketball was sacred in Glacier Valley, a tradition that predated Sarah's arrival by 15 years. The players ranged in age from 22 to 58, a cross-section of the community that included Tom Brennan, the high school principal whose competitive fire burned as bright at 45 as it had in his playing days, Jennifer Walsh, a 31-year-old emergency room nurse whose precise three-point shooting was legendary, and Bobby Big Dog Davidson, a 58-year-old retired logger whose massive frame still commanded respect under the boards, despite arthritic knees that required ice after every game. The evening had started like any other. Players began arriving around 6:30 p.m., changing in the small locker rooms, joking about weekend plans and Monday morning meetings. The gym filled with the familiar sounds of sneakers squeaking on polished hardwood, the sharp echo of basketballs being dribbled with varying degrees of skill, and the easy camaraderie of people who had been gathering in this space for years. Marcus had been going through his pre-game routine, the same series of stretches and practice shots he'd performed thousands of times, when Jennifer mentioned the smell. "Does something seem off to you guys tonight?" she asked, pausing mid-dribble as she worked on her ball handling near the free-throw line. "There's this weird musky smell, like wet dog, but stronger." Tom Brennan wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, his graying temples damp from the warm-up routine he still performed with military precision. "Probably just the ventilation system acting up again. Jimmy's been meaning to get the ductwork cleaned for months." Jimmy Castellanos, the facility manager, was a 42-year-old former Army sergeant who took pride in maintaining the aging building but was fighting a constant battle against a shrinking budget and infrastructure that was showing its age. But Jennifer's nose was rarely wrong. Her years as an ER nurse had given her an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was off, whether it was the metallic scent that preceded a code blue or the subtle chemical changes that signaled infection. Tonight, something primal in her brain was sending up warning flares, though she couldn't quite articulate why. The group had settled into their usual routine by 7:15 p.m. They'd divided into 2 teams of 5, with Marcus and Devon serving as informal captains. The first game was competitive but friendly, filled with the trash talk and easy physicality of people who trusted each other not to cross certain lines. Sarah had arrived late, straight from a day spent tracking radio-collared black bears in the Whitefish Range, her field clothes still carrying the scent of pine sap and high-altitude air. "You know," she said, settling onto the bleachers to watch while she changed into her basketball shoes, "I had the strangest encounter up north today. Found fresh grizzly sign less than 2 miles from here, heading southeast. Big male, probably around 400 pounds based on the track size." Bobby Davidson missed his next shot, the ball clanging hard off the rim. "How fresh?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful attention of someone who had spent 40 years working in the Montana wilderness. "This morning, maybe 6 hours old when I found it around noon," Sarah replied, lacing her sneakers with practiced efficiency. The interesting thing was the direction. Most bears this time of year are moving higher, looking for whitebark pine nuts. This one was coming down toward town. The game continued, but Sarah's words had planted seeds of unease that took root in subtle ways. Devon found himself glancing toward the gymnasium's main entrance more frequently. Jennifer's shots became more hurried, her usual rhythm disrupted by an anxiety she couldn't quite identify. Marcus noticed that his teammates seemed to be staying closer together, clustering near the center of the court, rather than spreading out to their usual positions. It was 8:23 p.m. when the lights went out. The power failure wasn't complete. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the gymnasium in an eerie red glow that transformed familiar spaces into something alien and threatening. The steady hum of the ventilation system died, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against their eardrums. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending branches scraping against the building's metal siding with sounds like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Generator should kick in any second," Jimmy called out, his voice echoing strangely in the altered acoustics of the darkened gym. He was moving toward the maintenance room, keys already in hand, when they all heard it. A sound that froze every person in that gymnasium to their core. The crash came from the building's rear entrance, the service door that led directly to the loading dock and the narrow strip of asphalt that separated the rec center from the forest. It wasn't the sound of wind or settling timber. This was something massive hitting the metal door with enough force to buckle the frame, followed by a guttural vocalization that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to genetic memories of being prey. Devon Rodriguez had heard that sound once before, during his first year as a paramedic, when he'd responded to a call in the mountains outside Phoenix. A hiker had surprised a black bear, and the animal's roar of challenge and aggression had been audible from a quarter-mile away. But this sound was deeper, more primal, carrying harmonics that suggested something much larger than the relatively small black bears of Arizona. "That's a grizzly," Sarah whispered, her professional composure cracking as she processed what her ears were telling her. "Big male, probably the same one I tracked today." The second impact came 30 seconds later, accompanied by the sound of splintering wood and the sharp ping of metal hardware failing. Through the gymnasium's high windows, they could see the beam of a flashlight dancing erratically, Jimmy trying to assess the damage while simultaneously backing away from whatever was testing the integrity of their refuge. Marcus felt his mouth go dry as his mind processed the tactical reality of their situation. The gymnasium had 3 exits, the main entrance they had all used, which led to the lobby and ultimately to the parking lot. The emergency exit on the north wall, which opened onto a narrow alley between the rec center and the adjacent fire station, and the service entrance where something was currently attempting to gain entry. The building's design, which had always seemed so open and welcoming, suddenly felt like a trap. "Everyone stay calm," Tom Brennan said, his principal's training kicking in as he moved to position himself between the group and the sounds of destruction coming from the rear of the building. "We need to get to the main entrance and out to the cars." But even as he spoke, they heard Jimmy's voice from somewhere near the maintenance room, high with panic. "It's in." Jesus Christ, it's inside the building. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows as the group instinctively moved toward the center of the court, forming a tight cluster that would have been tactically inadvisable against a human threat, but felt like the only response to something that operated by different rules. Devon's paramedic training warred with instincts that were older than civilization. Professional protocols crumbling in the face of terror that seemed to rise from the very marrow of his bones. "The main entrance," Jennifer said, her nurse's voice steady despite the fear that was making her hands shake. "We go together, we go fast, and we don't look back." They had taken perhaps 3 steps toward the lobby when the lights failed completely. The darkness that enveloped them was absolute, a black so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The emergency lighting system, already struggling with the power outage, finally surrendered, leaving them in a void broken only by the faint glow of cell phone screens as people frantically tried to activate flashlight apps with fingers made clumsy by adrenaline. The grizzly's presence filled the darkness like a living thing. They could hear it moving through the building, not with the careful stealth of a predator, but with the confident destruction of an apex predator that feared nothing. Cabinets crashed to the floor, chairs scraped across concrete, and underneath it all was the sound of breathing so deep and powerful it seemed to vibrate through the building's structure. Marcus found himself thinking about Emma, his daughter, and whether she would understand that her father had died trying to protect a group of friends rather than running for his own safety. The thought surprised him with its clarity. In all his imagined scenarios of death, he had never pictured something so primal, so utterly removed from the controlled environment of modern life. "It's following scent trails," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "All our gear, our shoes, the food people brought. We smell like prey to something that's probably been hungry for weeks." The sound of the grizzly's movement was getting closer, accompanied now by a huffing vocalization that bear biologists called woofing, a sign of agitation and aggressive intent that every person in that gym recognized at a cellular level, even if they couldn't have named it. Devon's flashlight app finally activated, sending a narrow beam of LED light cutting through the darkness. The white illumination revealed his teammates' faces, pale and stark with terror, but also showed them their path to the main entrance. 30 yards of polished hardwood, rows of folding bleachers that created obstacle courses of shadow, and then the double doors that led to the lobby and, presumably, to safety. They began moving as a group, feet sliding across the floor in an attempt to maintain silence while covering ground as quickly as possible. The basketball that Marcus had been holding lay forgotten on the center court, a spherical monument to the normalcy they had lost forever in the space between heartbeats. 20 yards from the exit, Jennifer stepped on something that crunched under her weight. The remains of a plastic water bottle, crushed flat. The sound echoed through the gymnasium like a gunshot, and in the silence that followed, they heard the grizzly's response. A roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a vocalization so loud and primal that it bypassed hearing and registered as pure vibration in their chests and bones. "Run," Sarah breathed, and then louder, "Run!" The next 30 seconds stretched into an eternity of terror and chaos. 10 adults, some in better physical condition than others, sprinting across a gymnasium floor in near total darkness, while behind them came the sound of something enormous moving with shocking speed. The grizzly's claws clicked against the hardwood like castanets, and its breathing filled the space with the rhythm of a locomotive. Tom Brennan, despite his competitive spirit, was not the fastest runner in the group. At 45, carrying the accumulated injuries of 2 decades of recreational basketball and a sedentary job, he found himself falling behind as younger, fitter bodies pulled ahead. He could hear the bear gaining ground, could feel the displacement of air as something massive moved through space behind him. The principal in him refused to abandon his people. Instead of continuing toward the exit, he turned, grabbing a folding chair from the nearest stack and brandishing it like a medieval knight with a shield. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and determination. "I'll buy you time." The grizzly emerged from the shadows like something out of humanity's darkest nightmares. In Devon's flashlight beam, they caught glimpses of a creature that seemed too large to be real. 400 pounds of muscle and bone moving with fluid grace, small eyes reflecting the light like malevolent stars, and claws that gleamed like polished obsidian. The bear's fur was dark brown, almost black in the artificial light, and scarred across the muzzle and shoulders in ways that suggested a lifetime of territorial battles and survival. Tom's chair lasted exactly 3 seconds against 400 pounds of predator. The grizzly swatted it aside with casual contempt, the aluminum frame crumpling like tissue paper. But those 3 seconds allowed Jennifer and Bobby to reach the main entrance, their hands fumbling for door handles in the darkness, while behind them the sounds of violence began. The bear's first swipe caught Tom across the chest, 4-inch claws raking through his basketball jersey and the flesh beneath as if neither existed. The principal's scream cut through the gymnasium like broken glass, a sound of pain so pure and terrible that it paralyzed the people trying to escape. Blood, black in the emergency lighting, splashed across the polished floor in arterial spurts that painted abstract patterns of violence. Marcus Chen found himself frozen between competing impulses, every rational thought screaming at him to run, while something deeper and more fundamental refused to abandon Tom to die alone. The software engineer had never considered himself particularly brave, but watching his friend being mauled triggered responses that predated agriculture and civilization. "Hey!" Marcus shouted, bouncing the basketball he had somehow retained throughout their flight. "Hey! Over here!" The grizzly's head swiveled toward the sound, small eyes locking onto Marcus with predatory focus. Tom Brennan lay crumpled against the bleachers, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths that suggested massive trauma. Blood pooled beneath him, reflecting the emergency lighting like a dark mirror. The bear's attention shifted, dismissing the wounded human in favor of the active threat. It moved toward Marcus with horrifying speed, claws clicking against hardwood in a rhythm that matched the software engineer's racing heartbeat. Behind the creature, Sarah Mitchell was pulling Tom toward the emergency exit, the principal's unconscious form leaving a trail of blood across the gymnasium floor. Marcus threw the basketball with all his strength, the orange sphere bouncing off the grizzly's massive skull with no more effect than a raindrop. The bear didn't even flinch, continuing its charge across the remaining distance with mechanical precision. At the last possible second, Marcus dove to his left, rolling across the hardwood as the grizzly's claws raked the air where his torso had been moments before. The bear's momentum carried it past Marcus and into the stack of folding chairs Tom had been defending. Metal crashed and scattered as 400 pounds of Predator tried to redirect its charge, buying Marcus precious seconds to scramble toward the emergency exit, where Sarah was struggling to drag Tom's unconscious form through the door. Devon Rodriguez reached them first, his paramedic training overriding the terror that was making his hands shake. "Sucking chest wound," he reported tersely, his fingers finding the tears in Tom's basketball jersey. "At least 3 ribs broken, possible punctured lung. We need to get him to a hospital now." The grizzly had recovered from its encounter with the chairs and was stalking toward them with the patient confidence of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. The emergency exit opened onto the narrow alley between the rec center and the fire station. But the fire station was closed for renovations, and its parking lot was blocked by construction equipment. Their cars were in the main parking lot, on the other side of a building that now contained a creature from their species' collective nightmares. "Cell phone," Jennifer gasped, her hands fumbling for the device in her jacket pocket. "Need to call 911. But the call went straight to the automated message that had become frustratingly familiar throughout the Flathead Valley. "All circuits are busy. Please try your call again later." The storm moving through northwestern Montana had knocked out cell towers across the region, leaving Glacier Valley effectively cut off from the outside world. The grizzly emerged from the gymnasium into the alley, moving with the careful precision of an animal that was learning to navigate human structures. In the better lighting of the alley, illuminated by a single streetlight that cast everything in harsh shadows, they could see the full magnitude of what they were facing. The bear was enormous, its shoulders reaching nearly 4 feet at the withers, with claws that extended 6 inches from massive paws. Scars crisscrossed its muzzle and neck, suggesting encounters with other bears, and possibly humans, that it had survived and learned from. Sarah Mitchell's wildlife biology training gave her insights that the others lacked, and what she saw terrified her more than the bear's size. "It's not acting normally," she whispered to Devon as they tried to keep Tom's airway clear while also watching for the creature's next move. "Healthy bears avoid humans. This one is actively hunting us." The grizzly approached with the patience of something that had learned that injured prey couldn't run far. Its breathing was steady and controlled, small eyes moving between the humans clustered around Tom's bleeding form with the calculating intelligence that made grizzlies the apex predators of North American wilderness. When it stopped 20 feet away and sat back on its haunches, the gesture somehow managed to be both casual and terrifying. "It's waiting for us to move," Marcus realized, his voice tight with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes with mortal fear. "It knows we won't abandon Tom, so it doesn't have to rush." Bobby Davidson had been silent since their escape from the gymnasium, the 60-year-old logger's face grey with shock and exertion. But 40 years of working in grizzly country had given him knowledge that went beyond what books could teach. "We need fire," he said quietly. "It's the only thing they really respect." The construction site provided them with materials, if they could reach them. Stacks of lumber, gasoline for generators, and work lights that might serve as torches if they could find a way to ignite them. But everything they needed was on the other side of 20 feet of open ground and a 400-pound predator that seemed content to wait them out. Tom Brennan's breathing was becoming more labored, his face taking on the waxy pallor that Devon recognized as the early stages of shock. The principal needed medical attention within minutes, not hours, or his children would be planning a funeral instead of visiting their father in the hospital. "I'm going for the construction site," Jennifer announced, her nurse's assessment of Tom's condition overriding her survival instinct. "If I can get a generator started, maybe the noise will scare it off." But before anyone could respond, the grizzly made its decision. The bear rose to its full height, nearly 8 feet of muscle and claws, and began moving toward them with purposeful intent. The waiting was over. What followed was violence of a kind that most humans never experience outside of their darkest nightmares. The grizzly's attack was not the frenzied assault of a panicked animal, but the methodical work of a perfect predator operating within its natural parameters. Sarah Mitchell found herself face to face with 400 pounds of evolution's most successful design, her wildlife biology training suddenly useless in the face of claws and teeth that had been refined over millions of years. The bear's first swipe caught her across the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the alley's brick wall. The impact drove the air from her lungs and sent her vision swimming, but the adrenaline flooding her system kept her conscious as she felt the warm spread of blood soaking through her shirt. Behind her, she could hear Devon shouting medical instructions to anyone who would listen, his paramedic training the only constant in a world that had suddenly become chaos. Marcus Chen did something that surprised even him. He charged. The software engineer who had spent 2 decades solving problems with logic and code found himself running straight at a creature that outweighed him by 250 pounds. His only weapon, a broken piece of aluminum siding that had been lying in the alley. The metal cut into his palms as he swung it like a baseball bat, connecting with the grizzly's skull in a ringing impact that sent vibrations up his arms. The bear turned toward this new threat with interest rather than anger, as if Marcus's attack was exactly what it had been expecting. The blow that had felt so solid to Marcus seemed to have no effect on the creature beyond confirming its assessment that these humans were prey rather than predators. When the grizzly's paw connected with Marcus's chest, it felt like being hit by a sledgehammer wielded by a professional demolition worker. Marcus found himself airborne, sailing across 10 feet of alley before impacting with a garbage dumpster that rang like a bell. The taste of blood filled his mouth, metallic and warm, and he could feel something grinding in his chest that suggested broken ribs. But he was alive, which was more than he had expected when he made his desperate charge. The grizzly's attention had shifted to Bobby Davidson, who was trying to help Devon move Tom's unconscious form toward the construction site. The logger's 40 years of wilderness experience had taught him to read animal behavior, and what he saw in the bear's posture terrified him more than its size. This wasn't a creature defending territory or reacting to surprise. This was a predator that had learned to associate humans with food, a behavioral change that wildlife biologists called food conditioning, and that almost always ended in tragedy. "It's not going to stop," Bobby realized, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge he wished he didn't possess. "Something's wrong with it. Healthy bears don't act like this." Sarah Mitchell, despite the blood streaming from her shoulder wound, was thinking the same thing. The grizzly's behavior patterns were completely outside normal parameters for the species. Bears were typically cautious around humans, preferring to avoid confrontation unless cornered or defending cubs. This animal was actively hunting them, showing persistence and tactical thinking that suggested either disease or a learned behavior pattern that made it exponentially more dangerous. The bear's next attack came without warning. One moment it was standing 30 feet away, apparently content to let them exhaust themselves with panic and desperate movement. The next, it was covering the distance between them with a speed that seemed to defy physics, claws extended and mouth open in a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jennifer Walsh never saw the blow coming. The emergency room nurse was focused on trying to get a pulse from Tom's carotid artery when 400 pounds of predator materialized beside her like something summoned from nightmare. The grizzly's claws raked across her back, 4 parallel lines of fire that sent her face first into the asphalt with a scream that cut through the Montana night like broken glass. Devon Rodriguez watched his friends being systematically destroyed by something that operated according to rules he didn't understand. His paramedic training had prepared him for car accidents, heart attacks, overdoses, and the random violence that humans inflicted on each other. But nothing in his experience had equipped him to provide medical care while being hunted by an apex predator that seemed to take pleasure in prolonging their suffering. Tom Brennan was dying. The principal's breathing had become increasingly shallow, his pulse rapid and thready in the way that Devon had learned to associate with massive internal bleeding. Without immediate surgical intervention, Tom would be dead within an hour, but the grizzly had positioned itself between them and any possible escape route, showing a tactical intelligence that suggested it understood exactly what it was doing. "We need to split up," Marcus gasped from beside the dumpster, his voice tight with pain from what felt like several broken ribs. "It can't track all of us at once." But Sarah Mitchell shook her head, her wildlife biology training overriding the desperation that was making everyone else think in terms of action movie scenarios. "That's exactly what it wants," she said, pressing her hand against the shoulder wound that was soaking her shirt with blood. "Bears are pursuit predators. They excel at running down scattered prey. Our only chance is to stay together and make ourselves look bigger and more dangerous than we actually are." The grizzly seemed to be listening to their conversation with the attention of something that was learning their behavioral patterns in real time. It had settled into a position that gave it optimal angles of attack while simultaneously blocking their access to potential weapons or escape routes. The intelligence behind its small eyes was disturbing in its implications. This was not a wild animal reacting on instinct, but a predator that had learned to hunt the most dangerous species on the planet. Bobby Davidson had been moving slowly toward the construction site while the bear's attention was focused on the others. The old logger's experience with grizzlies in the Montana wilderness had taught him that sometimes survival required patience rather than heroics. Power tools, gasoline, and materials for making noise or fire lay within 50 feet of their position, but reaching them would require crossing open ground under the direct observation of something that could cover that distance in under 3 seconds. The lumber pile included 2x4s that could serve as clubs, sheets of plywood that might function as shields, and most importantly, a 5-gallon container of gasoline intended for the generator. Fire was the one thing that even grizzlies respected, the one stimulus that could override their predatory confidence and trigger their avoidance behaviors. But gasoline was also explosive, and using it as a weapon in close proximity to injured people would require precision that seemed impossible under their current circumstances. Bobby's hands were shaking with adrenaline and fear, making fine motor control nearly impossible. The slightest mistake could turn their refuge into an inferno that would kill them more efficiently than the bear. The grizzly had begun moving again, circling their group with the patient precision of something that was in no hurry to end the hunt. Each step brought it closer to optimal attack position, while simultaneously reducing their options for escape or defense. Sarah recognized the behavior from her field studies. It was the same pattern she had observed in bears stalking salmon runs, a methodical approach that maximized success while minimizing energy expenditure. "It's playing with us," Jennifer whispered, her voice made thick by pain from the claw marks across her back. "It knows we can't hurt it, so it's taking its time." But Marcus Chen was remembering something from his college psychology classes, a lecture about learned helplessness in laboratory animals. The professor had described experiments where animals were subjected to stress they couldn't control, eventually becoming passive even when escape routes became available. The grizzlies' behavior seemed designed to induce exactly that response, breaking down their will to resist through sustained psychological pressure. "We're not helpless," Marcus said, more to himself than to the others. "We're not just going to lie here and die." The software engineer forced himself to his feet, despite the grinding pain in his chest, scanning the alley for anything that could be turned into a weapon. His eyes fell on the work light that the construction crew had left attached to the building's exterior wall, a halogen fixture that would be hot enough to cause serious burns if he could find a way to weaponize it. But before Marcus could act on his desperate plan, the grizzly made its move. The bear's charge began with deceptive casualness, a few steps that looked like ordinary movement until momentum built into something unstoppable. 400 pounds of muscle and bone accelerated across the alley with shocking speed, claws extended and mouth open in a roar that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth. Devon Rodriguez found himself directly in the creature's path, his paramedic training warring with instincts that urged him to abandon Tom's unconscious form and run for his life. Professional ethics won the battle, but just barely. Devon threw himself across Tom's body in a futile gesture of protection that he knew would likely cost him his life. The impact never came. Bobby Davidson's makeshift torch, a 2x4 wrapped in gasoline-soaked rags, caught the grizzly across the face in a shower of sparks and flame that sent the creature reeling backward with a bellow of surprise and pain. The old logger had moved with speed that belied his 60 years, crossing the distance to the lumber pile and back in the space of heartbeats, while the bear's attention was focused elsewhere. Fire changed everything. The confident predator that had been stalking them with methodical precision suddenly became something recognizably wild, backing away from the flames with vocalizations that spoke of genetic memories older than human civilization. Bears understood fire, respected it in ways that no other stimulus could match. "More!" Bobby shouted, his voice hoarse with smoke and exertion. "We need more torches." The construction site became a source of salvation as they improvised weapons from materials intended for building rather than warfare. Plywood sheets soaked in gasoline became shields that could be ignited at need. 2x4s wrapped in cloth became clubs that burned as they struck. The generator, once started, provided both light and noise that seemed to confuse and disturb the grizzlies' hunting patterns. But fire was also dangerous to them. The gasoline fumes filled the narrow alley with vapors that could ignite explosively if not handled with care. Sarah's shoulder wound was bleeding freely, and the combination of blood loss and smoke inhalation was making her coordination increasingly unreliable. Devon was trying to provide medical care to Tom while also helping to maintain their defensive perimeter, his attention divided between competing priorities in ways that compromised both. The grizzly had retreated to the far end of the alley, but showed no signs of abandoning its hunt. The bear was pacing back and forth, vocalizing with sounds that ranged from huffs of frustration to roars of challenge, testing the boundaries of their fire-based defense while looking for weaknesses to exploit. Its fur was singed across the muzzle and left shoulder where Bobby's torch had connected, but the wound seemed to have only increased its determination rather than driving it away. "It's not going to give up," Sarah realized, her voice tight with the knowledge that came from years of studying predator behavior. Food-conditioned bears don't respond to deterrence the way normal animals do. It's learned that humans are worth fighting for, even when we fight back. Marcus Chen was thinking about time and resources. Their improvised torches wouldn't burn forever, and the gasoline that made them effective was also finite. The grizzly could afford to wait them out, testing their defenses until exhaustion or diminishing supplies gave it the opening it needed. They needed either rescue or a way to eliminate the threat permanently, and neither seemed likely given their current circumstances. The sound of sirens in the distance changed everything. Fire Chief Patricia Hernandez had been conducting a routine inspection of the neighboring construction site when she saw flames and heard screaming from the direction of the recreation center. A 30-year veteran of emergency response, she had encountered bear incidents before, but never one that involved multiple casualties in an urban setting. The fire truck she dispatched carried water, foam, and most importantly, personnel trained to deal with emergency situations that fell outside normal parameters. The first responders' arrival transformed the tactical situation in ways that the grizzly couldn't have anticipated. High-pressure hoses delivered streams of water that could knock a grown man off his feet, while emergency flares provided both light and fire that could be deployed from a safe distance. The fire truck's air horn, designed to cut through urban noise, produced sounds at frequencies that seemed to cause the bear physical discomfort, but the grizzly was learning, adapting to new threats with the flexibility that made the species so successful. Rather than fleeing from the newcomers, it began moving toward the fire truck with the same methodical approach it had used in stalking the basketball players. 400 pounds of predator that had already tasted human blood was not easily deterred, even by professional emergency responders with specialized equipment. "Tranquilizer gun," Patricia radioed to dispatch, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from 3 decades of emergency response. "We need fish and wildlife here now, with enough pharmaceutical firepower to drop a grizzly." But Sarah Mitchell was shaking her head, her wildlife biology training providing context that the firefighters lacked. "Tranquilizers take time to work," she called out, her voice barely audible over the fire truck's engine. 10 to 15 minutes for full effect on something this size. It'll have time to kill all of us before it goes down." The grizzly's response to the fire truck was unlike anything in Patricia Hernandez's experience. Rather than retreating from the larger, noisier threat, the bear began stalking the vehicle with the same patience it had shown in hunting humans. It circled the truck while staying just outside the effective range of the water cannons, probing for weaknesses in their mechanical defense with disturbing intelligence. "It's not acting right," Patricia said into her radio, her professional composure beginning to crack as she watched the bear's tactical approach. "This thing is hunting us like it's done this before." Devon Rodriguez was losing Tom Brennan. The principal's vital signs were deteriorating despite Devon's best efforts to stabilize his injuries, and the combination of blood loss, trauma, and shock was pushing Tom's body beyond its limits. Without immediate surgical intervention, Tom would be dead within minutes, not the hours it might take to resolve their standoff with the grizzly. "I need to get him to a hospital," Devon announced, his paramedic training overriding the survival instinct that urged him to stay behind the fire truck's protective bulk. "Right now, or he's not going to make it." The ambulance was trapped on the other side of the construction site, blocked by equipment and debris that would take precious minutes to clear. Tom needed to be moved to the vehicle, across open ground that was currently being patrolled by something that had already demonstrated its ability to kill humans efficiently. The mathematics of trauma care were unforgiving. Every minute of delay reduced Tom's chances of survival by measurable percentages. Fire Chief Hernandez made a command decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. "Foam!" she ordered her crew, gesturing toward the grizzly, with movements that she hoped appeared more confident than she felt. "Full coverage, everything we've got." The fire suppression foam designed to smother petroleum fires proved surprisingly effective against a creature that had never encountered anything like it. The bear found itself engulfed in a substance that clung to its fur, interfered with its vision and scent abilities, and created a slippery coating that made movement treacherous. For the first time since the attack began, the grizzly showed signs of genuine distress, vocalizing with sounds that spoke of confusion rather than aggression. "Go!" Patricia shouted to Devon and the others. "Move Tom now, while it's distracted!" The next 3 minutes stretched into an eternity of desperate movement and barely controlled panic. Devon and Marcus carried Tom's unconscious form across the construction site, while Jennifer and Sarah provided what support they could, despite their own injuries. Behind them, the grizzly was shaking off the fire suppression foam with motions that sent droplets flying in all directions, its small eyes fixed on the escaping humans with predatory focus that hadn't diminished, despite its temporary confusion. The ambulance doors slammed shut just as the bear broke free of the last of the foam, its roar of fury echoing off the surrounding buildings with enough volume to set off car alarms throughout the neighborhood. Tom Brennan was finally receiving the medical care he needed, but the cost of his rescue had been measured in blood and terror that would scar everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The grizzly's rampage through Glacier Valley lasted another 6 hours. After losing its primary prey to the emergency responders, the bear began a systematic assault on the town itself, breaking into businesses and homes with the methodical thoroughness of something that had learned to associate human structures with food. 3 more people were injured before Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks personnel arrived with sufficient pharmaceutical firepower to bring down a creature that had become a 400-pound symbol of humanity's fragile position in the natural world. Dr. Amanda Foster's emergency room at Glacier Valley Regional Hospital became the center of a trauma response that challenged every protocol in their disaster preparedness manual. Tom Brennan arrived in full cardiac arrest, his chest cavity filled with blood from multiple organ lacerations that required immediate surgical intervention. Jennifer Walsh needed 127 stitches to close the claw marks across her back, while Sarah Mitchell's shoulder wound required surgery to repair damaged muscle tissue. Marcus Chen's broken ribs had punctured his left lung, necessitating a chest tube that would keep him hospitalized for a week. But the physical injuries were only the beginning of the recovery process that would stretch across months and years. Post-traumatic stress disorder manifested in different ways for each survivor. Devon Rodriguez found himself unable to enter enclosed spaces without experiencing panic attacks that made his work as a paramedic nearly impossible. Jennifer Walsh developed an aversion to outdoor activities that persisted long after her physical wounds healed. Marcus Chen's daughter Emma moved back from Billings to help care for her father. Their relationship deepened by shared vulnerability and the recognition of mortality that the attack had forced upon them. The investigation into the grizzlies' behavior revealed a story of human activity and environmental change that transformed a natural predator into something far more dangerous. Climate change had altered food sources throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, while increased human development had fragmented wildlife corridors and created new opportunities for negative human-bear interactions. The specific animal that attacked them had been food-conditioned by years of accessing human garbage and camping supplies, its natural caution replaced by aggressive confidence that made it willing to hunt humans as active prey rather than simply defending territory or reacting to surprise encounters. Wildlife biologist Sarah Mitchell's formal report to the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department became a case study in human-wildlife conflict that was distributed throughout North America. The Glacier Valley incident represented a new category of bear attack, one that challenged traditional safety protocols and required fundamental changes in how communities adjacent to wilderness areas prepared for and responded to wildlife encounters. The Glacier Valley Community Recreation Center was rebuilt 6 months later, but the Tuesday Night Basketball League never reformed. The bonds that had connected those 10 adults through shared love of a game had been replaced by trauma bonds forged in blood and terror that proved both stronger and more fragile than the relationships they had known before. Some of the survivors maintained close friendships based on their shared experience, while others found that any reminder of that night triggered emotional responses that made normal social interaction impossible. Tom Brennan survived his injuries, but required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation that forced him to retire from his position as high school principal. His recovery became a community effort that brought together students, parents, and faculty in ways that demonstrated both the resilience of small-town Montana and the enduring impact that violence could have on people who had considered themselves safe from the dangers that existed beyond civilization's carefully maintained boundaries. The grizzly's body was examined by researchers from the University of Montana, who found evidence of chronic malnutrition and environmental toxins that may have contributed to its abnormal behavior. Climate change, habitat fragmentation, and human encroachment had combined to create conditions that transformed a natural predator into something that operated outside the evolutionary parameters that had governed human-bear interactions for thousands of years. 5 years after the attack, Glacier Valley instituted new protocols for buildings adjacent to wilderness areas, including bear-proof security systems, emergency communication procedures, and community education programs designed to help residents understand and prepare for wildlife encounters that were becoming increasingly common throughout northwestern Montana. The recreation center's new design incorporated features that had been unimaginable before that March evening: reinforced doors, escape routes planned with predator behavior in mind, and emergency equipment that acknowledged the reality that civilization was only as secure as its weakest points of contact with the natural world. Marcus Chen kept the basketball that he had carried through their escape from the gymnasium, though he never played the game again. The orange leather sphere sat on his desk in the software company he founded after his recovery, a tangible reminder of the evening when a group of friends had learned that safety was an illusion and that survival sometimes required courage that most people never knew they possessed until circumstances demanded it of them. The nightmares faded slowly, replaced by a hypervigilance that never entirely disappeared and an appreciation for mundane moments that their pre-attack selves would have found incomprehensible. They had survived an encounter with something that operated according to rules older than civilization, and the knowledge changed them in ways that were both profound and impossible to communicate to people who had never faced genuine predation by something perfectly designed to kill them. In the end, the Glacier Valley grizzly attack became a case study in human adaptability and the thin line that separated civilization from the wilderness that surrounded it. 10 people had walked into a gymnasium on a March evening to play basketball, and 7 had walked out transformed by an encounter with mortality that stripped away illusions and revealed truths about courage, friendship, and the price of survival that would influence the rest of their lives. The next stories: Grizzly Bear. Slaughters 250-pound hunter in 90 seconds, October 3rd, 2025. The morning mist clung to the Blackfoot River Valley like a shroud, obscuring the jagged peaks of the Bob Marshall Wilderness that towered above the dense lodgepole pine forest. Matthew Big Matt Collins adjusted the straps of his Remington Model 700 rifle, the familiar weight of the weapon a comfort against his massive frame. At 6'4" and weighing in at 250 pounds of muscle earned through 23 years of construction work in Great Falls, Montana, Matt had never encountered anything in these mountains that gave him pause. Today would be different. The date was October 3rd, 2025, and the early morning air carried the crisp bite of autumn, temperatures hovering around 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Matt's breath formed small clouds as he checked his GPS coordinates one final time. 47.2619 degrees north, 112.7876 degrees west, placing him roughly 12 miles northeast of Great Falls, deep in the heart of known grizzly bear territory. The irony would not be lost on investigators later. Dr. Zara Chen, a wildlife biologist with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, had been tracking this particular area for the better part of 3 months. Her research focused on the behavioral patterns of a massive male grizzly bear, estimated at over 800 pounds, that had been exhibiting increasingly aggressive, territorial behavior. The bear, which she had designated as Bear 447 in her field notes, had been fitted with a GPS collar during a routine capture operation in July. What Dr. Chen didn't know that morning was that Bear 447's collar had malfunctioned 6 days earlier, and the animal had since expanded his territory by nearly 40%, moving closer to popular hunting areas. Matt Collins had been hunting these woods since he was 14 years old, following in the footsteps of his father, Robert Collins, and his grandfather before him. The Collins family had owned a small cabin on private land bordering the national forest for 3 generations, and Matt knew every ridge, every creek bed, every game trail within a 20-mile radius. His hunting partner, James Jimmy Patterson, a 34-year-old electrician from Great Falls, had been planning this elk hunting expedition for months. Jimmy's wife, Rebecca Patterson, had packed them enough provisions for 5 days, kissing her husband goodbye at 4:30 a.m., with the usual admonishment to be careful and come home safe. The third member of their party was Daniel "Danny" Martinez, a 26-year-old paramedic with Great Falls Emergency Services who had recently moved to Montana from California, seeking adventure in Big Sky country. Danny's experience in emergency medicine would prove both crucial and tragically insufficient in the hours to come. He carried a comprehensive first aid kit in his pack, including tourniquets, pressure bandages, and morphine injectors, supplies that would be desperately needed but ultimately inadequate for what was approaching through the morning shadows. At 7:15 a.m., the 3 men had established their temporary camp in a small clearing approximately 3 miles from the main trailhead. The area, known locally as Elk Meadow, sat at an elevation of 4,200 feet and provided excellent visibility of the surrounding terrain. Ancient Douglas fir trees, some over 100 feet tall, created a natural amphitheater around the meadow, their thick trunks scarred by decades of bear claws marking territory. Matt should have recognized the signs, but the excitement of opening day had clouded his usual caution. Wildlife photographer Amanda Rodriguez had been positioned in a tree blind roughly half a mile southeast of Elk Meadow since before dawn, hoping to capture images of the area's abundant wildlife. A freelance photographer for National Geographic, Amanda had spent 2 years documenting the grizzly bears of Montana and had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict their movements. Through her telephoto lens that morning, she observed what appeared to be unusually disturbed vegetation and scat that looked fresh, very fresh. She made a mental note to pack up early and move to a different location, a decision that would save her life. Bear 447 had not eaten in 3 days. The salmon runs that typically sustained the area's grizzly population through the fall had been delayed due to unseasonably warm weather, leaving the massive predator in a state of hyperphagic desperation. At over 20 years old, the bear was past his prime, but remained an apex predator of terrifying capability. His keen sense of smell, 7 times more powerful than a bloodhound's, had detected the hunter's scent from over 2 miles away. The combination of testosterone, gun oil, and processed food created an olfactory signature that triggered both curiosity and aggression in the ancient predator's brain. At 8:30 a.m., Matt Collins made the decision that would seal his fate. Despite Jimmy's suggestion that they stick together, Matt chose to scout alone toward a cluster of aspen trees roughly 400 yards north of their camp. "I'll be back in 30 minutes, he called over his shoulder, his voice echoing slightly in the thin mountain air. "If I find sign, I'll radio you on Channel 7. The Motorola two-way radio, clipped to his belt, would later be found crushed beyond repair, its internal components scattered across 20 feet of forest floor. Dr. Chen's research had documented that grizzly bears typically avoid human contact, with only 2.3 attacks per million visitor days recorded in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. However, her data also revealed that bears exhibiting hyperphagic behavior, the pre-hibernation feeding frenzy, were 7 times more likely to engage in aggressive encounters with humans. Bear 447 had not hibernated properly the previous winter due to an injury sustained in a territorial dispute with a younger male, leaving him in a state of chronic stress and perpetual hunger. The aspen grove that Matt approached had been ravaged by recent bear activity. Claw marks scored the pale bark of multiple trees, reaching heights of over 8 feet, clear evidence of a massive animal marking its territory. Scattered around the base of the trees were the remnants of the bear's feeding, strips of bark, uprooted vegetation, and several deep depressions in the earth where the animal had been digging for roots and grubs. Most ominous of all were the massive paw prints preserved in a patch of soft earth near a small seep spring. The prints measured nearly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, with clearly defined claw marks extending an additional 4 inches beyond the toe pads. At 8:47 a.m., according to the timestamp on Matt's smartphone, he photographed one of the massive paw prints. The image, later recovered from his damaged phone, would become key evidence in the subsequent investigation. In the background of the photo, barely visible among the shadows of the thick undergrowth, investigators would eventually identify what appeared to be the dark mass of Bear 447, watching from a distance of approximately 50 yards. The attack began with a sound that Matt would later describe, in his brief moments of consciousness, as resembling a freight train. Bear 447 had been stalking the hunter for nearly 7 minutes, moving with the surprising stealth that only a predator of his experience could muster. 800 pounds of muscle, bone, and primal fury launched itself from the shadows with a speed that defied physics. Grizzly bears can reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour in short bursts, faster than any human could hope to run. Matt Collins had perhaps 2 seconds to react. The human brain requires approximately 1.5 seconds to process a sudden threat and initiate a physical response. Matt's construction worker reflexes, honed by decades of dangerous work sites, served him better than most would have managed. He began to turn, his hands moving instinctively toward his rifle, but the bear's charge covered the remaining distance in a blur of brown fur and gleaming teeth. The initial impact drove Matt backward into the trunk of a massive Douglas fir, the collision producing a sound that Jimmy Patterson would later describe as like a car hitting a telephone pole. The bear's initial swipe, delivered with a paw the size of a dinner plate, caught Matt across the chest and shoulder, the 4-inch claws penetrating through his heavy hunting jacket, flannel shirt, and into the muscle beneath. The force of the blow, estimated by forensic investigators at over 400 pounds per square inch, lifted Matt off his feet and sent him sliding down the rough bark of the tree trunk. What followed was exactly 90 seconds of primal violence that would haunt the dreams of every first responder who arrived on scene. Bear 447, driven by starvation and territorial rage, seemed to view Matt not as a human being, but as a competitor for resources that needed to be eliminated. The bear's behavior, as later analyzed by wildlife experts, showed characteristics of both predatory and defensive aggression, a deadly combination that offered no opportunity for appeasement or escape. Matt's rifle, a trusted Remington Model 700 in .300 Winchester Magnum that had taken down dozens of elk over the years, remained strapped to his body throughout the attack. The weapon, capable of dropping a bull elk at 400 yards, was rendered useless by the speed and proximity of the assault. Later examination would show that Matt had managed to work one hand toward the rifle's action, but the bear's relentless attack prevented him from achieving the leverage necessary to bring the weapon into play. The sound of the attack carried through the still morning air like a siren call of disaster. Jimmy Patterson, who had been organizing gear at their camp, heard the initial roar and crash of the impact. "At first I thought maybe a tree had fallen," he would tell investigators hours later, his voice still shaking from shock. "But then I heard Matt screaming, and I knew something was terribly wrong." Jimmy's first instinct was to grab his own rifle and run toward the sound, but Danny Martinez, with his paramedics' training in crisis response, forced him to radio for help first. At 8:49 a.m., Jimmy Patterson's voice crackled through the emergency radio channels monitored by Cascade County Sheriff's Office. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Hunter Unit 7, calling for emergency assistance. We have a bear attack in progress at Elk Meadow. GPS coordinates 47.2619 degrees north, 112.7876 degrees west. Repeat, active bear attack, need immediate assistance." The dispatcher, Sarah Williams, had been on duty for 3 years and had handled numerous hunting accidents, but the panic in Jimmy's voice told her this was different. Danny Martinez's medical training kicked in as he grabbed his aid kit and Jimmy's rifle. "Stay on the radio with dispatch," he shouted over his shoulder as he began running toward the sounds of the attack. "Give them our exact coordinates and tell them to scramble, search, and rescue." As he ran, Danny could hear the continuing sounds of violence ahead, roars of animal fury, mixed with what he hoped were still human cries for help. The forest seemed to conspire against the rescue effort. Dense undergrowth caught at Danny's clothing and pack, fallen logs blocked the most direct routes, and the echoing quality of the mountain air made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location of the attack. Precious seconds ticked by as Danny fought his way through the wilderness, each passing moment diminishing Matt's chances of survival. At 8:51 a.m., the sounds suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the violence that had preceded it. Danny Martinez froze in place, straining his ears for any indication of life ahead. After 30 seconds that felt like hours, he heard a new sound that chilled him to his core, the heavy breathing of a large animal, punctuated by what sounded like feeding behavior. Drawing upon reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed, Danny continued forward, Jimmy's rifle clutched in hands that trembled despite his emergency training. As he approached the aspen grove, the scene that greeted him would require months of therapy to process. Matt Collins lay motionless at the base of the large Douglas fir, his body twisted at unnatural angles. Bear 447 stood over him, massive head lowered, investigating his victim with the detached curiosity of an apex predator. The bear's fur was matted with blood, and its breathing showed the labored pattern of an animal that had expended tremendous energy. When it raised its head to look at Danny, the paramedic found himself staring into small, dark eyes that held no malice, only the ancient calculation of a predator deciding whether this new human represented threat, food, or irrelevance. Danny Martinez had received training in bear encounters during his orientation with Montana Emergency Services, but no classroom instruction could have prepared him for this moment. The bear stood nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, its massive frame blocking most of the morning light that filtered through the canopy. Its mouth and muzzle were stained dark, and its breath came in visible puffs in the cold air. For perhaps 10 seconds, human and bear regarded each other across the small clearing. Danny's training told him to back away slowly, avoid direct eye contact, and make himself appear small and non-threatening. His heart, however, pounded with the desperate need to reach Matt and begin emergency medical treatment. The internal conflict between self-preservation and duty to help would haunt Danny's dreams for years to come. The bear made the decision for him. With a final look at the motionless form of Matt Collins, Bear 447 turned and melted back into the forest with surprising grace for such a massive creature. The sound of breaking branches and disturbed undergrowth faded quickly, leaving Danny alone with what remained of his friend. The medical assessment was grim. Matt Collins had suffered massive trauma to his chest and abdomen, his hunting jacket and shirt shredded beyond recognition. Multiple claw wounds had penetrated deep into muscle tissue, and several appeared to have damaged internal organs. Matt's pulse was thready and rapid, his breathing shallow and labored. Blood loss was significant, creating expanding pools on the forest floor that attracted swarms of flies despite the cool temperature. Danny's hands, steady through countless emergency calls in his professional career, shook as he cut away Matt's damaged clothing to assess the extent of his injuries. The 4 parallel claw marks across Matt's chest were the most obvious wounds, but deeper examination revealed additional trauma to his left shoulder, right thigh, and lower abdomen. Most concerning was the evidence of internal bleeding. Matt's abdomen was becoming distended, and his skin had taken on the gray pallor that Danny had learned to associate with severe shock. Working quickly, Danny established 2 IV lines using saline solution from his medical kit and administered morphine for pain management. He applied pressure bandages to the most severe external wounds and used his remaining tourniquets to control bleeding from the damaged thigh. All the while, he maintained radio contact with Jimmy Patterson, relaying Matt's condition to emergency dispatchers and providing constant updates on their GPS coordinates. At 9:15 a.m., the first helicopter from Montana Emergency Services lifted off from Great Falls, its crew consisting of pilot Captain Robert "Bob" Thompson, flight medic Elena Vasquez, and paramedic supervisor Mark Anderson. The aircraft, a Eurocopter AS-350, was equipped with advanced medical equipment and had a response time of approximately 25 minutes to the attack site. Every second would matter. Meanwhile, Cascade County Sheriff's Office had dispatched deputies Michael Chen and Patricia Rodriguez to establish a ground staging area at the main trailhead. Their role would be to secure the scene, coordinate with incoming rescue units, and ensure that no other civilians entered the danger zone while Bear 447 remained in the area. Sheriff Thomas Mitchell also authorized the deployment of the county's K-9 unit, specifically trained in wilderness search and rescue operations. Dr. Sarah Chen, the wildlife biologist who had been tracking Bear 447, received the emergency call at her field station at 9:22 a.m. Her immediate concern was not for the human victims, other professionals were handling that crisis, but for the bear itself. A grizzly that had attacked and potentially killed a human would face a death sentence unless extraordinary circumstances could be proven. Dr. Chen began preparing her research files and GPS tracking data, hoping to provide insight into the bear's behavior that might influence the inevitable decision about its fate. The helicopter's approach was audible from miles away, the distinctive thrum of rotor blades echoing off the mountain peaks and providing the first real hope that Matt Collins might survive. Flight medic Elena Vasquez had been responding to wilderness emergencies for 12 years, but bear attacks remained among the most challenging scenarios due to the extensive trauma typically involved. At 9:41 a.m., the helicopter touched down in Elk Meadow, its rotor wash scattering leaves and debris across the temporary campsite. Jimmy Patterson guided the medical team toward the aspen grove using hand signals, his voice having failed him after 2 hours of continuous radio communication with emergency services. The sight of professional medical equipment and trained personnel provided a psychological boost that helped sustain his hope for Matt's survival. Elena Vasquez and Mark Anderson reached the attack site at 9:43 a.m., their professional composure masking their shock at the extent of Matt's injuries. Elena immediately took over primary medical care from Danny Martinez, whose field treatment had undoubtedly saved Matt's life during the critical first hour after the attack. Mark Anderson focused on preparing Matt for helicopter transport, a process complicated by the severity of his injuries and the need to maintain spinal immobilization. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, replacing Danny's makeshift IV lines with advanced fluid replacement systems and administering blood expanders to combat shock. Elena carefully reassessed each of Matt's wounds, noting details that would be crucial for the surgical team awaiting their arrival at Benefice Health System in Great Falls. Most concerning was the evidence of intra-abdominal bleeding, which would require immediate surgical intervention once they reached the hospital. At 9:58 a.m., Matt Collins was loaded into the helicopter for the 20-minute flight to Great Falls. His vital signs had stabilized somewhat under the medical team's care, but remained critical. Elena Vasquez maintained constant radio contact with the hospital's trauma team, providing real-time updates on Matt's condition and allowing the surgeons to prepare for immediate intervention upon arrival. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, Chief of Emergency Surgery at Benefice Health System, had been notified of the incoming bear attack victim at 9:30 a.m. His surgical team, including Dr. Amanda Foster, thoracic surgery, Dr. James Liu, orthopedic surgery, and Dr. Sarah Kim, anesthesiology, began preparation for what they knew would be a complex, multi-hour operation. Bear attack victims typically presented with massive soft tissue damage, potential internal organ injury, and high risk of infection from the bacteria present in bear saliva and claws. The helicopter touched down at Benefice Health System at 10:21 a.m., where Matt Collins was immediately transferred to Trauma Bay 1. The systematic assessment revealed the full extent of his injuries: 4 deep claw wounds across his chest, penetrating into the muscle layers of his pectoralis major, damage to his left clavicle and shoulder joint, massive soft tissue trauma to his right thigh with potential femoral artery involvement, and most critically, evidence of liver laceration causing internal bleeding. Dr. Rodriguez made the decision to proceed immediately to emergency surgery, bypassing many of the usual pre-operative procedures in favor of damage control techniques designed to stop life-threatening bleeding. The surgical team worked in coordinated precision, Dr. Foster addressing the chest wounds, while Dr. Rodriguez focused on the abdominal trauma. Dr. Liu prepared to repair the shoulder damage once the immediate life threats were controlled. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 37 minutes. Matt Collins' injuries were extensive but not fatal, thanks largely to Danny Martinez's field treatment and the rapid response of the emergency medical team. The liver laceration was successfully repaired, the chest wounds cleaned and sutured, and the shoulder damage stabilized with plates and screws. Dr. Rodriguez's post-operative report noted that Matt's survival was due to several factors: his exceptional physical condition prior to the attack, the quality of initial field treatment, and the rapid transport to definitive medical care. While Matt fought for his life in surgery, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks launched their own emergency response to locate and evaluate Bear 447. Wildlife manager Robert Patterson, no relation to Jimmy Patterson, assembled a team consisting of bear biologist Dr. Sarah Chen, 2 wildlife technicians armed with tranquilizer equipment, and a local hunting guide familiar with the area's terrain. Their mission was to locate the bear, assess its behavior, and make the difficult decision about whether it could remain in the wild or required euthanasia. Dr. Chen's tracking data indicated that Bear 447 had moved approximately 2 miles southwest of the attack site, following a ridgeline that provided access to multiple escape routes. The bear's GPS collar had been malfunctioning, but the team was able to track him using traditional sign-reading techniques and Dr. Chen's intimate knowledge of his behavioral patterns. What they found suggested a bear in severe distress: erratic movement patterns, feeding behavior at unusual times of day, and territorial markings that indicated extreme agitation. The decision to euthanize Bear 447 was made at 2:15 p.m. on October 3, 2025. Dr. Chen argued passionately for relocation, citing the bear's previously non-aggressive behavior and the unusual circumstances that had led to the attack. However, state regulations and public safety concerns left wildlife officials with no alternative. Bear 447 was located at 3:42 p.m. and humanely euthanized with a single rifle shot administered by wildlife technician Mark Johnson. The necropsy performed on Bear 447 revealed crucial information about the factors that had led to the attack. The bear was severely undernourished, weighing only 623 pounds compared to the 800-plus pounds estimated from previous observations. His stomach contained minimal food content, and tissue samples showed elevated stress hormones consistent with prolonged starvation. Most significantly, examination of his paws revealed infected wounds, likely sustained during territorial disputes that would have impaired his ability to forage normally. Matt Collins regained consciousness at 6:30 p.m. on October 4, 2025, nearly 36 hours after the attack. His first words, whispered to the ICU nurse monitoring his vital signs, were, "Where's Jimmy? Is everyone okay?" The psychological trauma of the attack would prove more challenging to treat than his physical injuries. Matt experienced vivid nightmares, panic attacks triggered by unexpected sounds, and a complete inability to contemplate returning to the wilderness that had been his lifelong passion. The media coverage of the attack began within hours of the emergency radio call. Local news station KRTV was the first to report the incident, followed quickly by statewide and eventually national coverage. The story contained all the elements that modern media craves: dramatic rescue, life or death medical procedures, and the eternal conflict between human recreation and wildlife preservation. Unfortunately, much of the initial reporting was inaccurate, sensationalized, and focused more on creating compelling television than informing the public. Wildlife photographer Amanda Rodriguez, who had been in the area during the attack, provided the most accurate eyewitness account to investigators. Her photographs from that morning, while not capturing the attack itself, documented the extensive bear sign that should have warned experienced hunters away from the area. Her professional opinion was that the attack was entirely predictable given the environmental conditions and Bear 447's desperate physical state. The official investigation, led by Cascade County Sheriff's Office in cooperation with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, concluded that the attack was the result of multiple contributing factors: unseasonably warm weather disrupting natural food sources, Bear 447's compromised health status, and the hunters' decision to separate in known bear habitat. The investigation found no evidence of negligence or poor decision-making by any of the parties involved, classifying the incident as a tragic accident. Jimmy Patterson struggled with survivors' guilt and made the difficult decision to sell the family cabin, where 3 generations of Collins men had launched hunting expeditions. He established the Matthew Collins Wilderness Safety Foundation, dedicated to educating hunters and outdoor enthusiasts about wildlife safety and emergency preparedness. The Foundation's first initiative was to fund wilderness first aid training for hunters throughout Montana. Danny Martinez returned to his duties with Great Falls Emergency Services, but requested reassignment away from wilderness rescue operations. His quick thinking and medical training had undoubtedly saved Matt's life, but the psychological toll of witnessing such violence proved difficult to overcome. He eventually moved back to California, where he continued his paramedic career in an urban environment far removed from the forests of Montana. Dr. Sarah Chen published her research on Bear 447's behavioral patterns in the Journal of Wildlife Management, contributing valuable data about the relationship between environmental stress and wildlife aggression. Her work influenced new policies regarding hunting season timing and public notification systems for areas with unusual wildlife activity. She continued her bear research, but never again became as emotionally invested in individual animals as she had been with Bear 447. Matt Collins spent 3 weeks in the hospital and underwent 2 additional surgeries to repair nerve damage in his shoulder. His physical recovery was remarkable, with doctors crediting his pre-attack fitness and mental determination for his rapid healing. However, the psychological scars proved more persistent. He participated in extensive therapy through the Veterans Administration. Matt was an Army veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom and gradually regained much of his emotional stability. 1 year after the attack, on October 3, 2026, Matt Collins returned to Elk Meadow for the first time. Accompanied by a therapist specializing in trauma recovery and Jimmy Patterson, who had overcome his own fears to provide support, Matt spent 30 minutes at the site where he had nearly died. The aspen grove had grown back, obscuring most signs of the violent encounter, but the Douglas fir still bore scars from the impact of his body against its trunk. The return to the attack site provided Matt with a sense of closure he had been unable to achieve through therapy alone. Standing in the place where he had faced mortality, he felt neither fear nor anger, but rather a profound appreciation for life and the people who had fought to save him. He placed a small memorial plaque near the base of the Douglas fir, not to commemorate his suffering, but to honor the memory of Bear 447, an ancient predator who had died because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The legal ramifications of the attack extended for months beyond the incident itself. Matt's insurance company initially attempted to deny coverage for his medical expenses, claiming that hunting in known bear habitat constituted reckless endangerment. The case was eventually settled out of court, with the insurance company agreeing to cover all medical costs plus additional compensation for pain and suffering. The legal precedent established by the case influenced similar claims throughout the region. Wildlife management policies in Montana underwent significant revision following the investigation of Matt's attack. New protocols required enhanced public notification when GPS-collared bears showed unusual behavior patterns, even if the collar data was incomplete or malfunctioning. Hunter education programs were expanded to include more comprehensive training in bear awareness and emergency response procedures. Trail access points in high-risk areas were equipped with emergency communication devices linked directly to search and rescue operations. The economic impact of the attack extended beyond the immediate medical and rescue costs. Tourism to the area declined by approximately 30% during the following hunting season, as outdoors enthusiasts sought alternative destinations perceived as safer. Local businesses dependent on hunting and fishing tourism lobbied for increased wildlife management funding and improved emergency response capabilities to restore confidence in the region's recreational opportunities. Matt Collins eventually returned to limited hunting activities, but never alone and never in areas with significant bear populations. His experience fundamentally changed his relationship with the wilderness, replacing the confident familiarity of a lifetime outdoorsman with a cautious respect for the power and unpredictability of wild places. He became an advocate for wilderness safety education and frequently spoke to hunting groups about the importance of preparation and situational awareness. The scientific community gained valuable insights from the detailed documentation of Matt's attack and Bear 447's behavior. Dr. Chen's research contributed to a better understanding of the relationship between environmental stress and wildlife aggression, while the medical team's treatment protocols influenced emergency care procedures for similar incidents throughout the region. The case became a study example in multiple professional training programs. 5 years after the attack, Matt Collins published a book titled 90 Seconds, A Hunter's Survival Story, which became a bestseller in outdoor literature. The book provided a detailed account of the attack and its aftermath, but focused primarily on the human capacity for recovery and the importance of emergency preparedness. All proceeds from the book were donated to the Matthew Collins Wilderness Safety Foundation, which had grown into a regional organization providing safety training and equipment to hunters throughout the Rocky Mountain states. The story of Matt Collins and Bear 447 became part of the oral tradition of Montana's hunting community, passed down as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human resilience. The incident served as a reminder that despite human technological advancement and outdoor experience, the wilderness remains a place where nature's laws supersede human expectations. It reinforced the essential truth that successful outdoor recreation requires not only skill and preparation, but also humility and respect for the powerful forces that shape wild places. The attack site at Elk Meadow has since become an unlikely pilgrimage destination for hunters and outdoor enthusiasts seeking to understand the fine line between adventure and tragedy that defines wilderness recreation. The area remains open to public access with improved trail signage and emergency communication capabilities, but the forest has reclaimed most evidence of that violent October morning. Only those who know where to look can find the scars on the Douglas fir and the small memorial plaque that marks where man and bear met in a confrontation that changed multiple lives forever. In the final analysis, the attack on Matt Collins represented neither human failure nor animal malice, but rather the inevitable collision between two worlds, increasingly forced into contact by environmental change and human expansion into wild places. The incident served as a stark reminder that wilderness recreation carries inherent risks that cannot be completely eliminated through preparation or technology. The price of adventure in wild places will always include the possibility of encountering forces beyond human control, and the measure of our humanity lies not in avoiding these risks, but in how we respond when they become reality.